Have you ever wondered where the thunderbolt truly came from? Or why the seasons change? What if the very fabric of our world, the deepest human emotions, and the most terrifying nightmares were all born from a family saga of unparalleled drama and cosmic power? Welcome to the Epic Tales, where we embark on a journey through the entire, sprawling story of Greek mythology. A world of gods and monsters, heroes and villains, a world that continues to shape our own. Before the sun, before the moon, before even the stars had names, there was only chaos. Not chaos as we understand it, a mere jumble of things, but a vast, yawning void, a gaping emptiness, the primordial womb from which all existence would eventually spring. From this immeasurable abyss, the first beings, the protogenoi, or primordial deities, began to emerge, not born in any way we might comprehend, but simply becoming. First, there was Gaia, the earth herself, broad-bosomed and the ever-sure foundation of all the deathless ones who hold the peaks of snowy Olympus. Then, dim Tartarus, a misty, gloomy pit, as far beneath the earth is beneath the sky, a place of punishment and confinement. And then Eros, Desire, the fairest among the deathless gods, he who unnerves the limbs and overcomes the mind and wise counsels of all gods and all men. Some tales also whisper of Erebus, the impenetrable darkness, and his sister Nyx, the deep and starlit night, also born from chaos, veiling the cosmos in their shadowy embrace. Gaia, the earth, without any partner, brought forth Uranus, the starry heaven, her equal, to cover her on all sides, and to be an ever-sure abiding place for the blessed gods. She also bore the barren Pontus, the fruitless deep with its raging swell, the sea. These were her first children, born of her own essence. But it was with Uranus, the sky, that Gaia would truly begin to populate the nascent world. She lay with him, and their union, the embrace of earth and sky, was prodigiously fertile. First, they brought forth the 12 Titans, 6 sons and 6 daughters, beings of immense power and majesty. Oceanus, the world-encircling river, Coas, the inquisitive, Creus, the ram or constellation, Hyperion, he who walks on high, the first sun god, Epetus, the piercer, father of rebellious sons, and the youngest, most terrible of her children, Cronus of crooked counsel, who hated his lusty sire. Their Titaness sisters were Theia, the shining one, Rhea, the flowing, mother of gods, Themis, divine law and order, Mnemosyne, memory itself, golden-crowned Phoebe, and Tethys, the nurse, wife to Oceanus. These were the elder gods, destined to rule for an age. But Gaia and Uranus did not stop there. Next, they bore the 3 Cyclopes, one-eyed giants of incredible strength and skill, Brontes, the thunderer, Steripes, the lightner, and Argus, the bright. They were master craftsmen, forgers of the thunderbolt, and their single eye blazed with an unnerving intensity. And after them came the most monstrous of their offspring, the Hecatoncheires, the Hundred-Handers, Cottus, Briareus, and Gygus. Each possessed 100 invincible arms that sprang from their shoulders and 50 heads, their might truly dreadful. Uranus, however, looked upon these later children, the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, with a mixture of fear and revulsion. Their raw power and monstrous forms offended his sense of order, or perhaps he simply feared their potential to overthrow him. So as each was born, he cruelly pushed them back into the hidden depths of Gaia, into Tartarus, or some say, back into her very womb, causing his consort immense pain and anguish. Gaia groaned, her vast body strained and suffering under the weight of her imprisoned children. Her love for her offspring turned to a burning resentment against her tyrannical husband. The Earth Mother, grieving and enraged, devised a cunning plan. From her own depths, she fashioned a new metal, gray adamant, and from it, she forged a great, jagged-toothed sickle. Then, gathering her Titan children, she spoke to them of their father's cruelty and her own suffering, urging them to act. "My children," she pleaded, "children of a wicked father, if you will obey me, we should punish the vile outrage of your father, for he first thought of doing shameful things. Fear held most of them silent. The thought of challenging Uranus, the vast and powerful sky, was terrifying. But Cronus, the youngest, driven by his own hatred for his father and perhaps a touch of his mother's cunning, stepped forward. "Mother," he declared, "I will undertake this deed, for I do not care for our accursed father." He was the first to devise shameful acts. Gaia rejoiced, and she hid Cronus in ambush, giving him the adamantine sickle and instructing him in her deceitful plan. That evening, as Uranus descended upon Gaia, eager for love and unsuspecting of the treachery that awaited, Cronus sprang from his hiding place. With the great sickle, he seized his father's genitals and lopped them off, casting them away behind him to fall into the sea. The act was done. Uranus, emasculated and overthrown, recoiled in agony, his power broken. Dark drops of blood spattered from the wound onto Gaia, the earth. And even from this violent act, new life sprang. From those drops of blood that fell upon the earth, there arose the Erinyes, the Furies, relentless avengers of familial crimes, especially matricide and patricide. Also born were the Gigantes, the mighty armor-clad giants, and the Meliae, the ash tree nymphs. The severed members themselves, tossed into the churning ocean, drifted for a long time. White foam spread around them from the immortal flesh, and in that foam a maiden grew. First, she drew near to holy Cythera, and from there she came to sea-girt Cyprus. And there, this revered and beautiful goddess came forth, and grass grew under her slender feet. Her name was Aphrodite, the foam-born goddess of love, beauty, pleasure, and procreation. Thus, the reign of Uranus ended, and the age of the Titans began, with Cronus, the schemer, now enthroned as the king of the gods. He freed his Titan brothers and sisters from wherever Uranus had confined them, though some say he did not free the Cyclopes and Hecaton chairs, or soon re-imprisoned them himself out of similar fear. But the dying curse of Uranus and the warnings of Gaia echoed in his mind, that he too would be overthrown by one of his own sons. This prophecy would haunt Cronus and shape his own reign into one of fear and tyranny, mirroring the very father he had deposed. Cronus took his sister Rhea as his queen. As their children were born, one by one, the dread prophecy consumed him. Determined to avert his fate, Cronus committed an act as monstrous as his father's. As each child was born from Rhea's womb, he seized it and swallowed it whole. First Hestia, goddess of the hearth, then Demeter, goddess of the harvest, then Hera, future queen of the gods, then Hades, lord of the underworld, and finally Poseidon, master of the seas. Each one swallowed down into the dark belly of their father. Rhea was overcome with inconsolable grief and despair. To see her children born only to be devoured by their own father was an agony beyond measure. As she was about to bear her sixth child, Zeus, she pleaded with her parents, Gaia and Uranus, to help her devise a plan to save this child and to punish Cronus for his wickedness. They listened to her plight and revealed to her the fate's decree concerning her son. They then sent her to Lyctus in the rich land of Crete when she was ready to bear her youngest. Gaia undertook to receive the child and raise him in secret. So in a deep cave on Mount Ida, or perhaps Mount Dike, hidden from the world, Rhea gave birth to Zeus. She then swaddled a great stone, the Omphalos stone, in infant's clothes and presented it to Cronus. The mighty king, unsuspecting, took the stone and thrust it down into his own stomach, believing he had once again cheated fate. He did not know that his youngest son, the future king of gods and men, was safe, hidden away, destined to bring an end to the Titans' rule. And so, Zeus's infancy and childhood in the Cretan cave were meticulously orchestrated to ensure his survival and rapid ascent to power. Gaia, the Earth Mother, had seen enough tyranny under her husband Uranus and then her son Cronus. She now placed her hopes in this new grandson. Would you like me to narrate another script segment? She entrusted the infant Zeus to the care of the nymphs Adrastea and Ida, who were sometimes called daughters of Melesius, the Cretan king, or simply mountain nymphs. They nurtured the young god with devotion in the sacred Dictyan cave. The goat Amalthea, a divine creature of gentle eyes and abundant milk, became his foster mother. Her milk, richer than any mortal substance, imbued him with vigor, and one of her horns, accidentally broken by the playful young god, was blessed by him to become the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, a symbol of inexhaustible abundance. To ensure that the cries of the infant Zeus, which even then held a nascent divine power, did not reach the ever-vigilant Cronus, Gaia stationed the Caretes. These were spirited, youthful male dancers, armed and armored, who performed their wild, clashing war dances around the cave. They beat their spears against their shields, their rhythmic stomping and loud shouts, creating a cacophony that effectively masked any sound emanating from within, a shield of noise against a paranoid king. Sacred bees, perhaps sent by the nymph Melissa, another of his nurses, diligently gathered the purest honey from the slopes of Mount Ida, feeding it to the growing god, while majestic eagles, later to become Zeus's sacred birds, were said to have brought him sips of nectar and morsels of ambrosia, accelerating his divine maturation. Under this extraordinary care, Zeus grew at a phenomenal rate, not in years, but in seasons. His divine nature burgeoned, his limbs filled with an awesome strength, and his mind, sharp and perceptive, quickly grasped the injustices of his father's reign and the destiny that awaited him. Gaia, and some say the spirit of the deposed Uranus, who still held a presence in the sky, revealed to him the full, grim story: the swallowing of his siblings, the prophecy of Cronus' downfall, and the expectation that Zeus would be the one to usher in a new, more just cosmic order. This knowledge ignited in Zeus a burning resolve, a righteous fury tempered by a burgeoning wisdom. He was no mere rebel. He was a liberator, a restorer of balance. His first crucial alliance was with Metis, the Titaness, whose name embodied cunning intelligence and profound wisdom. Daughter of the ancient sea gods Oceanus and Tethys, Metis possessed the gift of prophecy and the ability to shapeshift. She saw the inevitability of Cronus' fall and the potential in Zeus to be a different kind of ruler. She became his confidant and strategist, her keen intellect guiding his raw power. It was Midas who concocted the plan to free Zeus's siblings. She prepared a potent emetic, skillfully mixed with honeyed wine or nectar, designed to compel Cronus to regurgitate his imprisoned children. The administration of this draft was a masterstroke of cunning. Would you like me to narrate another segment? Some tales whisper that Zeus, cloaked in an unassuming disguise, perhaps as a new, young cupbearer in his father's celestial court, served the potion himself, his heart steady, despite the immense risk. Other versions credit Midas with tricking Cronus into consuming it, perhaps by appealing to his vanity, suggesting it was an elixir of even greater power or a cure for some invented ailment. However, it was accomplished. Cronus, the great Titan king, who had devoured his own children to secure his throne, drank the fateful potion. The reaction was swift and violent. Racked by internal convulsions, Cronus first expelled the stone he had swallowed in Zeus's stead. This large, smooth stone, the omphalos, was later retrieved by Zeus and placed with great ceremony at Delphi, beneath the slopes of Mount Parnassus. It became a sacred relic, a tangible link to the overthrow of the old regime, marking for mortals the very navel, the center of the world. Then, one by one, in reverse order of their ingestion, his divine children emerged from his gullet, not as infants, but as fully grown, powerful deities, their divine essence untarnished by their dark confinement. Poseidon, lord of the surging seas, was first, then Hades, the somber future king of the underworld, followed by the majestic Hera, the bountiful Demeter, and finally Hestia, the gentle goddess of the hearth. Their gratitude to Zeus, their youngest brother and savior, was immeasurable. They immediately pledged their allegiance, their combined might forming the nascent core of the Olympian faction. The age of Titans was teetering. Rhea, their mother, who had endured unimaginable anguish watching child after child disappear into Cronus, finally felt a surge of hope and vindication. Her gamble, her desperate plea to Gaia and Uranus, had borne fruit. Her youngest son was not only alive, but was now poised to challenge the tyranny that had caused her such profound sorrow. Her support for Zeus was unwavering, though her heart likely ached at the prospect of a war that would pit her son against her husband and brothers, with his 5 powerful siblings at his side: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. Zeus established his headquarters on the lofty peaks of Mount Olympus, a natural fortress whose cloudy summit seemed to touch the very heavens. From this vantage point, they prepared to challenge the old order. Cronus, enraged by this betrayal and the sudden appearance of his full-grown children, rallied his loyalist Titans on Mount Othrys, a slightly lesser but still formidable mountain range. These were not beings to be underestimated. They included his formidable brothers: Coeus, the Titan of intellect and questioning; Creus, often associated with constellations in the south; Hyperion, the High One, who was a precursor to Helios as the sun god, his brilliance still immense; and Iapetus, the Piercer, whose sons would play significant roles on both sides of the coming conflict. Most prominent among Cronus' generals was Iapetus' son, the immensely strong Atlas, destined for a terrible fate. These titans, rulers of the cosmos for an age, were not inclined to relinquish their power without a fight. They represented tradition, the established order, and perhaps a genuine belief in Cronus' right to rule, or simply a fear of the chaos that a change in leadership might bring. Their pride, too, was a factor. They were the elder gods, the first true rulers, and the thought of being supplanted by a younger generation, by their own nephews and nieces, was an affront. Zeus understood that courage and righteousness alone would not be enough. Gaia, ever the guiding force, advised him that ultimate victory depended on freeing her other children, the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, who had been imprisoned in the dark depths of Tartarus. Uranus had first incarcerated them, and Cronus, despite his own rise against tyranny, had perpetuated their confinement, fearing their monstrous strength and untamable nature. Their liberation would not only gain Zeus powerful allies, but also serve as a symbolic act, rectifying an ancient injustice and demonstrating Zeus's commitment to a broader, more inclusive divine family. Thus, Zeus, embodying the daring leadership that would characterize his reign, undertook the perilous journey into Tartarus, the deepest, darkest pit beneath the earth, a place of punishment and shadow. There, in that joyless realm, he found the one-eyed giants Brontes, Thunderer, Steropes, Lightner, and Arges, Bright, their single eyes still smoldering with suppressed power and the resentment of ages. He also found the 100-handers, Cottus, Briareus, also called Aegeon, the sea goat, by mortals due to his immense power sometimes associated with sea storms, and Gyges. These beings, each possessing 100 powerful, untiring arms and 50 heads that darted in all directions, were terrifying to behold, their very presence exuding raw, chaotic might. Their ancient jailer was Camp, a monstrous, chthonic dragon woman, her form a nightmarish amalgamation of creatures, the upper body of a beautiful woman, the lower body of a scaled dragon, a venomous scorpion's tail that whipped menacingly, and a horrifying cluster of animal heads, lions, boars, and dogs, bristling around her waist, each snarling and snapping. Zeus, in a display of his growing might and unwavering determination, confronted and slew Campe, shattering the adamantine chains that bound his uncles. The gratitude of the freed giants was profound and immediate. The Cyclopes, master artisans of the divine, their single eyes gleaming with renewed purpose, immediately set their ancient forges ablaze in the heart of Tartarus, or perhaps brought their skills to Olympus. For Zeus, they fashioned the Kerounos, the thunderbolt, a weapon that crackled with the raw, untamed energy of the storm, capable of splitting mountains asunder and striking down any foe with unerring accuracy, a symbol of his supreme authority. For Poseidon, they created the trident, a magnificent three-pronged spear that granted him dominion over the restless oceans, the power to stir the waves into monstrous tsunamis, shatter rocks with a gesture, and command the earth itself to tremble with earthquakes. For Hades, they crafted the Kuni, the helm of darkness, also known as the cap of invisibility, which could render its wearer completely unseen by gods or mortals, allowing for stealth, surprise, and passage through the most guarded territories. These were not mere weapons. They were potent symbols of authority, extensions of the gods' divine domains, and game-changing instruments of war. The Hecatoncheires, their myriad arms now free to act, their 50 heads roaring their battle cry, pledged their colossal strength to Zeus's cause. The very thought of these beings in battle, each capable of picking up and hurling 100 massive boulders simultaneously as if they were pebbles, was enough to instill profound terror in their enemies. Their allegiance was a turning point, adding an element of overwhelming, almost unimaginable destructive force to the Olympian side. They became Zeus's shock troops, their arrival on any battlefield signaling utter devastation. Not all titans, however, stood with Cronus. Themis, the personification of divine law, justice, and custom, and her son Prometheus, the forethinker, whose penetrating intellect allowed him to see the currents of fate and the inevitable outcome of the war, wisely chose to side with Zeus. Prometheus, in particular, recognized the inherent flaws in Cronus's fearful and oppressive rule, and the cyclical nature of power, believing Zeus offered a chance for a more balanced and potentially more enlightened cosmos. His brother Epimetheus, the afterthinker, often impulsive and less discerning, followed Prometheus's lead, perhaps out of loyalty or a simpler understanding of the changing tides. Oceanus, the primordial titan of the vast world-encircling river, and his wife Tethys chose a path of neutrality, their watery domain remaining largely aloof from the terrestrial war, though many of their thousands of daughters, the Oceanids, including Metis, Zeus's first counselor, and the formidable Styx, actively supported the Olympians. Styx, in a significant show of loyalty, was said to be the very first to bring her children, Zealous, rivalry, emulation, Nike, victory, Kratos, strength, power, and Bia, force might, to join Zeus's ranks. As a reward for her timely allegiance, Zeus decreed that her name and her river would be honored forever, and oaths sworn upon the river Styx would be the most solemn and unbreakable vows for all gods, a testament to her crucial early support. On the opposing side, Cronus gathered his staunchest supporters. His brothers Coeus, Creus, and Hyperion stood by him, their power still immense, and their resolve hardened by the challenge to their reign. Iapetus, a titan of considerable might, also sided with Cronus, a decision that tragically pitted him against his own sons Prometheus and Epimetheus, adding a bitter familial dimension to the cosmic struggle. Atlas, son of Iapetus and thus nephew to Cronus, became one of Cronus's foremost commanders, his legendary strength and endurance a bulwark for the Titan cause. The Titanesses, for the most part, including Rhea, Thea, and Phoebe, did not actively participate in the direct fighting, though their allegiances were clear, with Rhea fervently, if secretly, hoping for her son's victory and the end of her husband's cruel reign. And so, the cosmos braced itself for the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans. For 10 long, brutal years, the universe was convulsed by this epic struggle. Mount Olympus, the gleaming citadel of Zeus and the new gods, its peaks wreathed in storm clouds and divine light, faced Mount Othrys, the ancient, craggy stronghold of Cronus and the elder deities. The very fabric of reality seemed to tear as gods clashed with unimaginable ferocity. Mountains were ripped from their foundations and hurled across the sky like colossal missiles. The earth groaned and split open in gaping chasms. The seas boiled and surged, flooding lands and then receding in terrifying maelstroms. The sky itself flashed with the unnatural light of divine weaponry, thunderbolts, trident blasts, and the raw, untamed power of battling deities. The air was filled with the deafening roar of battle, the shattering clash of primordial forces, and the earth-shaking cries of warring gods. It was a conflict of unimaginable scale and ferocity, a generational war that would not only decide who ruled the heavens, but would also shape the destiny of the cosmos and all beings within it for eons to come. The primordial silence that had once characterized chaos was utterly shattered by the thunder of war, a conflict so devastating and transformative that its echoes would forever be etched into the memory of the universe, a foundational epic of destruction and recreation. The first years of the Titanomachy were a grinding, brutal stalemate, the raw, ancient power of the elder titans, who had ruled the cosmos since the dawn of time, met the fiery, determined energy of the younger Olympians, fueled by righteous fury and the desire for a new order. Day after cosmic day, the battle raged, a relentless storm of divine power. Cronus, still formidable despite his age and the prophecy hanging over him, fought with the desperation of a king clinging to his throne. His brothers, Hyperion, Coeus, and Creus, unleashed torrents of primordial force, their attacks shaking the very foundations of existence. Hyperion, the titan of heavenly light, blazed with an intensity that seared the battlefield, while Coeus, the embodiment of the inquisitive mind and the axis of the heavens, directed his attacks with cold, calculating precision. Atlas, a towering figure of immense strength, son of Iapetus, distinguished himself early on as Cronus's most formidable field commander, his mighty blows capable of shattering mountains and sending shockwaves across the warring realms. On the Olympian side, Zeus, now truly coming into his own as a warrior king, was a whirlwind of destructive energy even before his ultimate weapon was fully brought to bear. Would you like me to read another piece of text? His siblings fought with a ferocity born of their long, unjust imprisonment and their loyalty to their liberator. Poseidon, wielding the raw power of the ocean, even before the trident was his, summoned colossal waves and earthquakes that fractured the Titan's defenses on Mount Othrys. Hades, grim and resolute, commanded the shadows and the very earth, his presence a chilling harbinger of doom for his foes. Hera, majestic and fierce, fought with a queenly fury, her divine power a match for many of the elder gods. Demeter, though a goddess of bounty, unleashed the earth's fury in defense of her new cause, and even Hestia, the gentle goddess of the hearth, contributed her divine essence to the Olympian effort, her steadfast presence a source of inner strength for her embattled family. The children of Styx, Nike, Kratos, Bia, and Zeus, were ever present at Zeus's side, embodying victory, strength, force, and emulation, their divine attributes bolstering the Olympians' resolve and effectiveness. But it was the introduction of the divine weaponry, forged by the grateful Cyclopes, that began to decisively turn the tide. When Zeus first unleashed the Chronos, the thunderbolt, the effect was cataclysmic. Blinding flashes of lightning, more potent than any natural storm, tore through the Titan ranks, each bolt striking with pinpoint accuracy and devastating force. The roar of his thunder echoed across the cosmos, a sound that struck terror into the hearts of his enemies. The thunderbolt was not merely a weapon. It was a declaration of Zeus's supreme power, a symbol of the new, dynamic force that was seizing control of the universe. Cronus and his allies had nothing to match its sheer destructive capability. Poseidon, now armed with his mighty trident, became an even more terrifying force. With a mere gesture, he could cleave the earth, sending Titan warriors tumbling into gaping chasms. He commanded the seas to rise up in mountainous waves, crashing down upon the slopes of Othri, eroding its defenses and scattering its defenders. The earth itself trembled and bucked under his power, making the Titans' own mountain stronghold an unstable battleground. Hades, wielding the Kuni, the Helm of Darkness, became an invisible agent of disruption and fear. He could move unseen among the enemy, sowing discord, striking from the shadows, and gathering intelligence. His unseen presence unnerved the Titans, who never knew when or where he might appear, or if he was watching them even in their most secret councils. The helm allowed him to pass through their lines, to understand their strategies, and to deliver critical blows at opportune moments, a silent, deadly wraith in the heart of the war. Yet, even with these powerful new armaments and the growing prowess of the Olympian gods, the Titans were deeply entrenched, their ancient power vast, and their numbers initially formidable. The war dragged on, year after agonizing year. The universe itself seemed to groan under the strain of this unending conflict. Gaia, the earth, suffered immensely as her children and grandchildren warred upon her surface, her body rent and scorched by their cataclysmic battles. She had hoped for a swift resolution, a quick end to tyranny, but the sheer tenacity of the Titans prolonged the agony. It was then that Zeus, heeding Gaia's earlier counsel and perhaps inspired by a strategic insight from Prometheus or Metis, unleashed his most terrifying and decisive allies, the Hecatoncheires, Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, the Hundred-Handers. Their 50 heads, roaring in a symphony of destruction, waded into the fray. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Each of these monstrous beings with their 100 powerful arms could pick up and hurl hundreds of massive boulders, entire hilltops, simultaneously. They became living siege engines, their volleys of stone raining down upon Mount Othries with such relentless, crushing force that the Titans' defenses began to crumble. The sky darkened with the sheer volume of rock and debris they launched, each impact shaking the cosmos. The Titans, for all their individual might, had no answer to this sustained, overwhelming barrage. Their formations broke, their morale shattered. The sight of these 100-armed, 50-headed giants, their eyes blazing with the fury of ages spent in Tartarus, their voices a cacophony of battle cries, was enough to instill primal terror, even in the hearts of the elder gods. Briareus, in particular, was said to be a storm of destruction, his 100 hands a blur as he tore apart the Titan lines. The Titans fought back with the courage of despair. Cronus, seeing his reign slipping away, redoubled his efforts, his ancient power flaring in a last, desperate defense. Atlas rallied the remaining Titan forces, his own colossal strength a bulwark against the Olympian onslaught, but even he could not stem the tide indefinitely. The other loyalist Titans, Hyperion, Coeus, Creus, battled fiercely, but they were increasingly outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by the combined might of the Olympians, their new weapons, and the unstoppable Hecatoncheires. The strategic genius of Prometheus, who, though not a primary combatant, offered invaluable counsel to Zeus, also played a crucial role, helping the Olympians anticipate Titan moves and exploit their weaknesses. Themis, embodying divine justice, lent a moral authority to Zeus's cause, further isolating Cronus and his faction. The war reached its brutal climax. Zeus, ablaze with the power of the Chronos, his eyes flashing with lightning, led the final assault on Mount Othries. The thunderbolts fell like rain, shattering the peaks of the Titans' mountain stronghold. Poseidon's trident ripped open the earth beneath their feet, while the Hecatoncheires buried them under an avalanche of stone. The remaining Titans, battered, bruised, and broken, finally succumbed. One by one, they were defeated and captured by the triumphant Olympians. Cronus himself, the mighty king who had once ruled the universe, was overthrown, his power extinguished, his reign of fear finally at an end. His crooked counsel had led him to the same fate he had inflicted upon his own father. Would you like me to narrate another script? The Titanomachy, the 10-year war that had convulsed the cosmos, was over. Victory belonged to Zeus and the Olympians. The universe, scarred and weary from the conflict, slowly began to settle. The air, once thick with the smoke of battle and the cries of warring gods, began to clear. Mount Olympus stood resplendent, its peaks untouched by the devastation, a symbol of the new order. Mount Othrys, in contrast, lay shattered and broken, a testament to the fall of the old gods. The fate of the defeated Titans was severe. Most of those who had actively fought against Zeus, including Cronus and his loyal brothers Coeus, Creus, and Hyperion, along with many of their lesser kin, were bound in unbreakable chains, forged perhaps by the Cyclopes or Hephaestus, who would soon emerge. They were then cast down into the deepest, darkest abyss of Tartarus, the same gloomy pit where Uranus had once imprisoned the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires. This was a place as far beneath the earth as the earth is beneath the sky, a joyless, misty realm guarded by impenetrable bronze gates, forged by Poseidon, and surrounded by a threefold layer of night. The Hecatoncheires themselves, ironically, were appointed as their jailers, their loyalty to Zeus ensuring that the vanquished Titans would never again threaten the peace of the cosmos. There, in the crushing darkness, the defeated elder gods were to languish for eternity, a stark warning against rebellion, against the new divine order. Not all Titans shared this grim fate. Atlas, for his prominent role as Cronus' chief general, and for his immense strength, received a unique and terrible punishment. He was condemned to stand at the western edge of the world, some say at the Pillars of Hercules, and to bear the weight of the heavens, Uranos, upon his mighty shoulders for all time. This eternal burden was a constant reminder of his rebellion and the power of Zeus. His brothers, Prometheus and Epimetheus, who had sided with Zeus, were spared imprisonment, though Prometheus' story would take a different, tragic turn later, due to his complex relationship with mankind and his defiance of Zeus on their behalf. The Titanesses who had not actively participated in the war, such as Rhea, Thea, Phoebe, Mnemosyne, and Tethys, were generally left unmolested, their ancient dignities respected, though their power and influence were greatly diminished under the new Olympian regime. Oceanus, who had remained neutral, continued to encircle the world with his vast river, his domain largely untouched by the shift in power. The Omphalos stone, which Cronus had swallowed in Zeus's place, was recovered and set up by Zeus at Pytho, under the glades of Parnassus, to be a sign and a marvel for mortal men in times to come. It marked Delphi as the navel of the world, a sacred center where the new king of the gods had symbolically anchored his victory over the old. With the Titans defeated and imprisoned, and the cosmos finally at peace after a decade of relentless war, the reign of Zeus and the Olympians truly began. The age of chaos and brutal cyclical tyranny was over. A new era was dawning, an era that promised a more structured, if not always perfectly just, governance of the universe. The Olympian gods, young, powerful, and victorious, now stood ready to divide the spoils of their hard-won victory and establish their dominion over the heavens, the seas, the underworld, and the earth itself. The foundation for a new mythology, filled with its own dramas, triumphs, and tragedies, had been laid in the ashes of the Titanomachy. The echoes of this titanic struggle, however, would resonate throughout all of subsequent myth, a constant reminder of the immense power that had been overthrown, and the precariousness of even divine authority. The fear of a similar uprising, perhaps from their own offspring, would subtly influence the actions and decisions of the new ruling gods, just as it had their predecessors. The cycle of power, though seemingly broken, casts a long shadow. The shadow of past rebellions, however, still lingered in the divine consciousness. Gaia, though defeated in her direct assault via the giants, was not entirely pacified. Her ancient power and her connection to the very fabric of existence meant she remained a formidable, if often dormant, force. And from her union with Tartarus, that gloomy pit of punishment, she had produced one last, ultimate horror, a final desperate challenge to Zeus's authority, Typhon, also known as Typhoeus. This was no mere giant. Typhon was a creature of unimaginable terror, the most monstrous being ever born. Hesiod describes him as a creature of 100 dragon or serpent heads, each with flickering, dark tongues and eyes that blazed with fire. From these heads came a cacophony of horrifying sounds. Hisses, bellows, the roars of lions, the yelps of dogs, and sometimes even articulate speech that the gods themselves could understand. His vast winged body stretched to the stars, his lower half consisting of gigantic viper coils that, when uncoiled, reached to his very head and emitted a continuous hissing. His hands, too, ended in 100 serpent coils, or were simply hands of immense strength. Fire flashed from his eyes, and as he moved, rocks and earth were scorched and torn asunder. When Typhon first advanced upon Olympus, the sheer terror of his approach was so overwhelming that most of the Olympian gods, in a moment of uncharacteristic panic, fled. They transformed themselves into various animals and scattered across the land of Egypt to escape his wrath. Zeus became a ram, Hera a white cow, Aphrodite a fish, Ares a boar, Apollo a crow or a hawk, Artemis a cat, Dionysus a goat, Hephaestus an ox, Hermes an ibis, and Leto a shrew. Would you like me to narrate another segment? Only Athena, it is said by some, stood her ground initially, scorning Zeus for his flight, though even she eventually recognized the overwhelming danger. This flight of the gods, though a shameful episode, underscored the almost unimaginable horror that Typhon represented. Zeus, however, quickly rallied. He knew that if Typhon were to prevail, the cosmos would be plunged back into a state of primordial chaos worse than anything seen under Uranus or Cronus. This was not a battle for mere supremacy, but for the very survival of the ordered universe he had fought so hard to establish. Armed with his unfailing thunderbolts and the adamantine sickle, the same weapon Cronus had used against Uranus, perhaps retrieved from Gaia or specially reforged, Zeus confronted the monster. The ensuing battle was the most cataclysmic of all. The earth quaked, the seas boiled, the heavens thundered, and fire rained down from the sky as Zeus and Typhon clashed. Zeus hurled volley after volley of thunderbolts, searing Typhon's myriad heads and setting vast swaths of the earth ablaze. Typhon retaliated with streams of fire from his eyes and mouths, and with the crushing force of his serpentine coils. Mountains were torn up and thrown as weapons. The conflict raged across the world, from Greece to Syria. In one phase of the battle, Typhon managed to get the upper hand. He grappled with Zeus and, using his viper coils, ensnared the king of the gods. He then managed to strip Zeus of his thunderbolts and, using the very same adamantine sickle, cut out Zeus's sinews from his hands and feet, rendering him helpless. Typhon then carried the incapacitated Zeus to the Carishan cave in Cilicia, modern-day Turkey, and hid the severed sinews there in a bearskin, setting the dragon woman Delphine, possibly Camp Reborn or a similar creature, to guard them. The cosmos hung in the balance. With Zeus defeated and immobilized, Typhon's victory seemed assured. However, Hermes, the swift messenger god, and Pan, the rustic goat god, or sometimes Cadmus, the mortal hero, in a different version, embarked on a daring rescue mission. Hermes, with his characteristic cunning and stealth, managed to distract Delphine, while Pan, or Cadmus, located and skillfully restole the sinews. Some say Pan terrified Delphine with a sudden, piercing shriek, the origin of the word panic. They then reattached the sinews to Zeus, restoring his strength and divine power. Reinvigorated and burning with an even greater fury, Zeus burst forth from the cave. He pursued Typhon, who was now attempting to flee. Zeus, mounted on a chariot drawn by winged horses, relentlessly pelted the monster with thunderbolts. The battle reached its climax near Mount Etna in Sicily, or sometimes Mount Casius in Syria. Typhon, wounded and desperate, hurled entire mountains at Zeus, but Zeus deflected them with his thunderbolts, sending them crashing back down upon the monster. Finally, in a last, decisive blow, Zeus either buried Typhon beneath Mount Etna or struck him down with such force that he was cast into Tartarus, to lie forever imprisoned alongside the defeated Titans. The volcanic activity of Mount Etna was thereafter attributed to the fiery breath and restless rage of the defeated Typhon, trapped beneath its weight. The defeat of Typhon was Zeus's ultimate triumph. He had faced down the most terrifying embodiment of primordial chaos and emerged victorious, securing his reign and the Olympian order for all time. No greater threat would ever arise to challenge his supremacy. The gods who had fled in terror returned to Olympus, their respect for Zeus's power and courage renewed, if tinged with a memory of their own momentary weakness. This final, earth-shattering conflict served as a definitive end to the age of monstrous challenges and cosmic upheavals. The universe, though bearing the scars of these titanic wars, was now firmly under Olympian control. With all major threats neutralized, the Olympian gods settled into their roles as rulers of the cosmos. Zeus, undisputed king of the gods, presided over his celestial court on Mount Olympus. This magnificent palace, hidden from mortal eyes by a veil of clouds, was a realm of dazzling light, feasting, music, and divine drama. Here, the 12 primary Olympians, though the exact list could vary slightly between traditions and over time, held sway. Besides Zeus himself, there was his queen Hera, goddess of marriage, Poseidon, lord of the seas, Demeter, goddess of the harvest, Apollo, god of light, music, prophecy, and healing, Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon, Ares, god of war, Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, Hermes, the messenger god, patron of travelers, thieves, and commerce, Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, Hephaestus, god of fire and the forge, and Hestia, goddess of the hearth, or in later versions, Dionysus, god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy, who is said to have taken Hestia's place when she willingly stepped down to tend the sacred fire of Olympus. Hades, while a brother of Zeus and a major deity, was not typically counted among the 12 Olympians, as his domain was the underworld, and he rarely visited their mountain abode. Life on Olympus was far from consistently harmonious. The gods, despite their immortality and immense power, were possessed of very human-like emotions: love, jealousy, ambition, anger, and pettiness. Zeus, for all his majesty and wisdom, was notoriously unfaithful to Hera, his countless affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women leading to frequent and furious marital disputes. Hera, consumed by jealousy, often exacted cruel revenge on Zeus's lovers and their offspring. These divine quarrels and intrigues formed the basis of a vast number of myths, illustrating the complexities of power, desire, and family dynamics, even at the highest cosmic level. Poseidon, from his watery kingdom, could be a staunch ally, or a formidable rival to his brother Zeus. His moods as unpredictable as the sea itself. His disputes with Athena over the patronage of Athens, or his anger towards Odysseus, showcased his proud and often vengeful nature. Demeter's profound grief over the abduction of her daughter, Persephone, by Hades, would lead to the creation of the seasons, a myth demonstrating the deep interconnectedness of divine emotions and the natural world. Apollo and Artemis, the twin archers, were powerful and sometimes aloof, their arrows bringing plague or sudden death, but also healing and illumination. Ares reveled in bloodshed and conflict, often clashing with the more strategically minded Athena. Aphrodite, born of sea foam and primal desire, wielded immense influence over gods and mortals alike, her affairs and interventions often causing chaos and delight in equal measure. Hermes, quick-witted and fleet-footed, darted between worlds, carrying messages, guiding souls, and engaging in mischievous exploits. Hephaestus, the lame smith god, though often mocked for his appearance or his wife Aphrodite's infidelities, was the master craftsman whose creations were indispensable to the gods. Beyond their internal dramas, the Olympians turned their attention more fully to the burgeoning race of mortals. The creation of humanity is a complex story with several versions, often involving the Titan Prometheus, who, despite siding with Zeus in the Titanomachy, became mankind's greatest benefactor and, consequently, a figure of defiance against Zeus's absolute authority. In one prominent account, Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus were tasked by the gods with creating mortals and equipping them with the qualities necessary for survival. Epimetheus, the afterthinker, impulsively distributed all the best gifts: fur, claws, wings, strength, speed, to the animals, leaving nothing for humankind, who were left naked and vulnerable. Prometheus, the forethinker, seeing their plight, felt immense pity. He then, in an act of profound rebellion and compassion, stole fire from the gods, Some say from Hephaestus' forge, others from the sun chariot of Helios, and brought it down to earth hidden in a hollow fennel stalk. Fire was a transformative gift, enabling humans to cook food, forge tools and weapons, keep warm, and ward off predators. It was the spark of civilization itself. Zeus was enraged by this theft and by Prometheus' general advocacy for mankind. Fire was a divine privilege, and its possession by mortals represented a dangerous elevation of their status, a blurring of the lines between the human and the divine. For his transgression, Prometheus was subjected to a horrific punishment. Zeus had him chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, where every day an eagle, an emblem of Zeus, would come and devour his liver. Since Prometheus was immortal, his liver would regenerate each night, only to be eaten again the following day, condemning him to an eternity of agonizing torment. This brutal punishment served as a stark warning to any who might dare to defy the king of the gods. But Zeus's retribution did not end with Prometheus. He also sought to punish mankind for accepting the stolen gift of fire. He commissioned Hephaestus, the divine smith, to craft the first woman from earth and water. Athena then endowed her with skills in weaving and adorned her with beautiful garments. Aphrodite bestowed upon her irresistible beauty and charm. Hermes gave her a cunning, deceitful mind and a persuasive voice. This creation, a beautiful evil, as Hesiod called her, was named Pandora, meaning all gifted, because each of the gods had contributed something to her making. Zeus then sent Pandora down to earth as a gift to Epimetheus, Prometheus' foolish brother. Prometheus had warned Epimetheus never to accept any gift from Zeus, but Epimetheus, captivated by Pandora's beauty, forgot his brother's counsel and welcomed her. Pandora brought with her a pithos, a large storage jar, often mistranslated as a box, which she had been forbidden by the gods to open. Curiosity, however, a trait perhaps implanted by Hermes, gnawed at her. Eventually, she could resist no longer and lifted the lid of the jar. Instantly, all the evils and miseries that had hitherto been unknown to humanity flew out and spread across the earth. Sickness, old age, labor, pain, vice, death, and countless other plagues. Horrified, Pandora slammed the lid back down, but it was too late. Only one thing remained trapped inside the jar, clinging to its rim: Elpis, hope. And so, while mankind was now subject to all manner of suffering, hope remained, a fragile solace in a world suddenly filled with hardship. This myth explained the origin of evil and suffering in the world, attributing it to both divine retribution and human curiosity, or frailty. It also subtly underscored Zeus's power to shape mortal destiny, and his intolerance for any challenge to his authority, or the established cosmic hierarchy. The golden age of blissful, carefree existence for mortals, if it ever truly existed, was definitively over. Humanity now had to toil, suffer, and ultimately die, but they also possessed fire, the potential for civilization, and the enduring presence of hope. The pervasive wickedness that spread throughout the world, particularly in the later ages of mankind, did not go unnoticed by the gods. Zeus, whose duty it was to uphold justice and order, grew increasingly dismayed by the contempt mortals showed for divine law and for each other. Hesiod, in his Works and Days, famously chronicled humanity's descent through 5 distinct ages, each marking a further decline from a state of primordial grace, save for one heroic interlude. The very first of these was the Golden Age, a blissful era under the benevolent reign of Cronus. Mortals of this time lived like gods, untouched by sorrow, toil, or the infirmities of old age. The fertile earth spontaneously provided all their needs, and they passed their days in peace and festivity. Death, when it came, was like a gentle sleep. How was that? After passing, they became pure, benevolent spirits, daemones, who roamed the earth as guardians of later generations of mortals, cloaked in mist, bestowing wealth and watching over judgments, a royal privilege they received. Following this idyllic period, the Olympians, now under Zeus, created the Silver Age. This generation was far inferior. Its people spent 100 years as witless children, coddled by their mothers. When they finally reached maturity, their lives were short and filled with distress due to their own foolishness and arrogance. They were violent towards one another, and, most critically, they refused to honor the Olympian gods with sacrifices or proper reverence. Their impiety angered Zeus, who eventually grew weary of their insolence and put an end to their race. Though less honored than the golden spirits, they too became blessed spirits dwelling beneath the earth. Zeus then fashioned a third race, the Bronze Age of Man. These were a terrifying and warlike people, sprung from ash trees, the same source as the Myliae nymphs. Their hearts were as hard as adamant, their strength prodigious. Their lives were consumed by the brutal works of Ares. Endless war, violence, and acts of outrageous hubris. They forged weapons and tools of bronze, lived in bronze houses, and even consumed flesh rather than cultivated grain. Ultimately, their own insatiable aggression led to their downfall. They destroyed each other in ceaseless conflict and descended, nameless and unlamented, to the dark and chilling realm of Hades. After the Bronze Age, Zeus, in a moment of divine foresight, or perhaps as a testament to the enduring possibility of nobility, created a fourth generation, the Age of Heroes. This was a race nobler and more just, the demigods, many of them offspring of gods and mortal women. These were the heroes who fought in the great epic sagas, such as the war against Thebes, with its 7 gates, and the protracted siege of Troy. Though they too faced hardship, toil, and the grim realities of war, their deeds were glorious and their names immortalized in song. For some of these heroes, Zeus ordained a special fate after death. Instead of descending to Hades, they were transported to the Isles of the Blessed at the very ends of the earth by the deep eddying stream of Oceanus. There they dwell, free from care, in a land that yields honey-sweet fruit 3 times a year, living under the gentle rule of Cronus, whom Zeus had by then released from his subterranean prison specifically for this purpose. A remarkable act hinting at a cosmic reconciliation or a cyclical pattern of justice. Finally, Hesiod describes the 5th age, the Iron Age, which he lamented was his own. This era was characterized by unceasing labor, sorrow, and moral degradation. Men were afflicted by troubles. Day and night, the bonds of family and hospitality were shattered. Children dishonored their parents. Oaths were broken with impunity. Justice and righteousness were replaced by the rule of might. Envy, with its foul tongue and delight in evil, became a constant companion to wretched mortals. Hesiod prophesied that Zeus would eventually destroy this generation too. When men are born with gray hair at their temples, when all vestiges of shame, respect, and divine awe have vanished from the earth. It was this pervasive wickedness, particularly exemplified during the Iron Age, or perhaps at a nadir of human behavior that transcended any single epic, that deeply troubled Zeus. Tales of mortal depravity, their disregard for oaths, their cruelty to guests, and their general impiety reached the heights of Olympus. Determined to ascertain the truth for himself, Zeus resolved to descend to Earth, disguised as a mortal traveler, to witness firsthand the state of humanity. His journey took him to the rugged, mountainous region of Arcadia in the Peloponnese, a land ruled by King Lycaon. Lycaonens, a son of the autochthonous Pelasgus, was a figure of complex repute. He was credited with founding a cult to Zeus Lycaeus, Wolf Zeus, or Zeus of Light, and establishing athletic games in his honor. However, darker whispers clung to his name, rumors of barbaric practices, including human sacrifice. He had many sons, said to be as arrogant and impious as their father. When Zeus, in the guise of a weary traveler, arrived at Lycaon's palace, he gave subtle indications of his divine nature, hoping to elicit respect. Lycaon, however, was either profoundly skeptical or possessed by a malignant arrogance. He decided to put the stranger's divinity to a gruesome test. His plan was twofold. First, to attempt to murder the visitor in his sleep, and second, to serve him human flesh for dinner. To this end, Lycaon, or his equally depraved sons, slaughtered a hostage. Some say a Molossian youth, others one of Lycaon's own children, perhaps his youngest son Nyctimus. They then prepared a meal from the victim's remains, roasting some parts and boiling others, and insolently presented this horrific repast to their disguised guest. Zeus, of course, was not deceived. His divine omniscience instantly perceived the abomination. His wrath was immediate and cataclysmic. The dining table was overturned, and the palace itself was consumed by divine fire. Lycaon, struck with terror, fled the blazing inferno and ran howling into the countryside. As he fled, a horrifying transformation overcame him. His clothes shredded and became a coarse gray fur, his arms contorted into forelegs, his skin hardened. his human voice devolved into the guttural snarls and howls of a wolf. He became the first werewolf. His name, Lycaon, etymologically linked to Lycos, the Greek word for wolf. His innate savagery, once cloaked by a human form, was now his permanent bestial reality. He continued to roam the wilds, his thirst for blood undiminished, attacking flocks of sheep, yet still retaining some vestiges of his former human appearance. His gray hair, his fierce, glaring eyes. Most of his 50 sons, complicit in the sacrilege, were struck down by Zeus's thunderbolts, though some traditions say they too were transformed into wolves. In certain versions of the myth, Nyctimus, the sacrificed child, was restored to life by Zeus and went on to rule Arcadia, representing a fragile hope amidst the prevailing depravity. The unspeakable impiety of Lycaon and his household served as the final damning proof for Zeus. It confirmed his gravest fears about the pervasive corruption of mankind. Returning to Olympus, his heart heavy with disgust but firm in his resolve, Zeus convened the Council of the Gods. He declared his intention to obliterate the entire human race with a cataclysmic flood, to wash the earth clean of their wickedness. The other gods, though initially taken aback by the sheer scale of this judgment, ultimately concurred, acknowledging the depth of mortal transgression. Some expressed concern about who would then remain to offer sacrifices and honor the gods, but Zeus, ever imperious, assured them he had a plan for a new and perhaps better race of mortals. Yet, even in his righteous fury, a sliver of foresight, or perhaps a lingering affection for some aspect of humanity, allowed for a narrow path to survival. Prometheus, still enduring his torment chained to the Caucasus Mountains, possessed the gift of foreknowledge. Despite his own suffering at Zeus's command, his ancient connection to mankind, particularly through his son Deucalion, prompted him to act. Deucalion, king of Phthia in Thessaly, was a man renowned for his justice and piety. He was married to Pyrrha, the daughter of Prometheus and Pandora, and she too was virtuous and God-fearing. They stood as rare exemplars of goodness in a largely corrupt world. Prometheus managed to warn Deucalion of the impending deluge, instructing him to construct a large chest or ark, and to provision it carefully for a long voyage. Deucalion and Pyrrha heeded the Titan's warning without question. They built their vessel, and just as the skies began to roil with unnatural darkness, they entered the ark and sealed themselves within. Then Zeus unleashed the full force of his divine wrath. He imprisoned Boreas, the north wind, and all the other winds that might clear the sky, and let loose Notus, the south wind, laden with torrential rain. The floodgates of heaven burst open, and rain poured down in relentless sheets. But mere rain was insufficient for the depth of Zeus's anger. He called upon his brother Poseidon, lord of the sea. Poseidon struck the earth with his mighty trident, causing devastating earthquakes that tore open subterranean springs and released vast quantities of underground water. He commanded the river gods to overflow their banks, to surge across the plains and valleys, transforming fertile lands into raging torrents. The sea itself rose, its waters engulfing coastal cities and sweeping inexorably inland. Soon, the entire earth was submerged. Mountains became fleeting islands, and then even their highest peaks disappeared beneath the churning, boundless waters. All terrestrial life, men, women, children, and animals, drowned, their homes, cities, and civilizations obliterated, washed away without a trace. Only those creatures adapted to water or capable of sustained flight had any chance of survival, and even their resting places vanished. The world was reduced to a watery wasteland, a grim echo of the primordial chaos that existed before creation. For 9 days and 9 nights, the ark carrying Deucalion and Pyrrha drifted aimlessly upon the face of the infinite waters. Throughout their ordeal, they maintained their piety, praying fervently to the gods. Finally, as Zeus's anger began to subside and the waters started to recede, their ark came to rest on the summit of Mount Parnassus, its twin peaks being among the first land to re-emerge from the flood, though other traditions name Mount Etna in Sicily, Mount Athos, or Mount Othrys in Thessaly as the landing site. When Deucalion and Pyrrha disembarked, they stepped out into a world utterly transformed and desolate. A vast expanse of mud, slime, and debris stretched before them, silent and empty. They were, as far as they knew, the sole human survivors. Overcome by loneliness and the sheer scale of the devastation, they wept. Seeking guidance, They made their way to a partially submerged, slime-covered sanctuary of the goddess Themis, an ancient deity of divine law, order, and prophecy, who had remained neutral during the Titanomachy and was respected by Zeus. There, they prostrated themselves and prayed for a way to restore the human race. Themis, or perhaps Zeus speaking through her oracle, responded to their heartfelt plea with a cryptic instruction: "Depart from my temple, veil your heads, loosen your girded garments, and toss the bones of your great mother behind your backs." Deucalion and Pyrrha were initially bewildered and horrified. To disturb a parent's grave, to unearth and scatter their bones, was a profound sacrilege. However, Deucalion, being the wise son of Prometheus, pondered the oracle's enigmatic words. He reasoned that their great mother could be none other than Gaia, the earth herself, and her bones must therefore be the stones scattered upon her surface. Understanding illuminated his mind. He explained his interpretation to Pyrrha. Together they veiled their heads as instructed, loosened their robes, and began to walk away from the temple, gathering stones from the muddy ground. As they walked, Deucalion threw stones over his shoulder, and from each stone he threw, a man sprang forth, fully formed. Pyrrha, following his example, threw stones over her shoulder, and from her stones, women emerged. Thus, a new race of mortals was created, a people hardy and resilient, born from the very fabric of the earth, fittingly called Laos, people, from the Greek word las, stone. These new humans were inherently suited for a life of toil and hardship, as their stony origin implied, but they also carried within them the seeds of renewal and the capacity to rebuild civilization from the ruins of the old world. Was the narration suitable for your needs? Deucalion and Pyrrha became the revered progenitors of this new human race. Their son, Hellen, was considered the eponymous ancestor of all Hellenes, the Greeks. Hellen, in turn, had 3 sons: Doris, Xuthus, who fathered Ion and Achilles, and Aeolus. These sons became the legendary founders of the principal Greek tribes, the Dorians, Ionians, Achaeans, and Aeolians, respectively. This myth of the Great Flood and the subsequent recreation of humanity not only explained the repopulation of the earth, but also provided a foundational genealogical narrative for the Greek people, linking them directly to this pivotal moment of divine judgment, destruction, and ultimate renewal. The world had been cleansed of its previous corruption, but the memory of the flood and the transgressions that caused it would endure as a potent cautionary tale, woven deep into the Greek consciousness. The stage was now set for new generations of mortals, new heroes, and new complex interactions with the ever-watchful Olympian gods, who had once again asserted their absolute power over the destiny of mankind. The hardy new race of mortals, born from the stones cast by Deucalion and Pyrrha, began to spread across the cleansed earth. They were a people steeled by their very origin, accustomed to toil and resilient in the face of adversity. From Hellen, son of Deucalion, and his sons Doris, Xuthus, and Aeolus, the great tribes of the Hellenes, Dorians, Ionians, Achaeans, and Aeolians, trace their lineage, each carving out territories and establishing the foundations of future city-states. Civilization, sparked anew by the gift of fire Prometheus had so dearly paid for, and now rekindled after the great deluge, began its slow, arduous ascent. Yet, this new dawn for humanity did not mean an age of uninterrupted peace, nor did it mean freedom from the often capricious and overwhelming influence of the Olympian gods, who watched from their celestial citadel, their passions and plans already weaving new threads into the tapestry of mortal fate. Indeed, the king of the gods himself, Zeus, despite the profound lessons one might have expected from the recent cataclysm, soon demonstrated that his amorous inclinations remained as potent as ever. On the Phoenician coast, in the prosperous city of Tyre, ruled King Agenor. Agenor had several sons, including Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix, and one daughter, Europa, whose beauty was so radiant it captivated all who beheld her, including, unfortunately for her peace, the mighty Zeus. Observing her one day as she gathered flowers with her companions in a seaside meadow, Zeus was smitten. Desiring to approach her without causing alarm or provoking Hera's immediate wrath, he transformed himself into a magnificent white bull, more splendid than any mortal creature. His hide was a dazzling snow-like white, his horns were perfectly curved like a crescent moon, and his eyes shone with a gentle, intelligent light. This majestic creature ambled into the meadow, its presence so serene and captivating that Europa and her friends, far from being frightened or enchanted. Europa, bolder than her companions, admired the bull's beauty, stroked its flank, and even wove garlands of flowers around its gleaming horns. The bull, Zeus in disguise, knelt before her with an air of gentle submission. Emboldened and charmed, Europa playfully climbed onto its broad back. This was the moment Zeus had awaited. The bull instantly rose, and with Europa clinging to its back in surprise and then terror, charged towards the sea. It plunged into the waves, swimming with astonishing speed and power, carrying the shrieking princess away from her homeland, across the vast expanse of the sea. Her companions could only watch in helpless dismay as she disappeared over the horizon. Zeus bore Europa westward, eventually landing on the shores of Crete. There, he revealed his true divine form and lay with her. From this union, several illustrious sons were born, including Minos, who would become the legendary king of Crete and judge of the dead, and Rhadamanthus, also a renowned lawgiver and judge in the underworld. The continent to which she was carried would, in time, bear her name, Europe. Back in Tyre, King Agenor was consumed by grief and rage at the disappearance of his beloved daughter. He summoned his sons, Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix, and commanded them to search for Europa, with the stern injunction that they were not to return to Tyre without her. The young men set out on their desperate quest, each taking different paths, their hearts heavy with the seemingly impossible task. Phoenix would eventually give up the search and settle in a land that would be named Phoenicia after him. Cilix, too, would abandon the quest and lend his name to Cilicia in Asia Minor. But Cadmus, driven by filial duty and a deep love for his sister, persevered. For years, he wandered through distant lands, enduring hardships and disappointments, but finding no trace of Europa. The world was vast, and a maiden spirited away by a god was a quarry beyond mortal finding. Finally, weary and despairing, Cadmus sought divine guidance. He journeyed to the sacred oracle of Delphi, the very center of the world marked by the Omphalos stone, to consult Apollo. The Pythia, Apollo's priestess, delivered the god's pronouncement. Cadmus was to abandon his search for Europa. Instead, he was to follow a specific cow, one he would find wandering alone, bearing a distinctive marking like a full moon on its flank. Where this cow eventually lay down to rest, there Cadmus was to found a new city. Obedient to the oracle, Cadmus set out once more, and soon enough, in the pastures of Phocis, he encountered the prophesied cow. He and his remaining loyal companions followed the animal as it ambled patiently across the rugged landscape of Boeotia. For many miles, the cow led them, until finally, in a fertile plain, it sank to the ground, exhausted. This, Cadmus knew, was the destined site for his city. Overjoyed, he resolved to offer the cow as a sacrifice to Athena, who had often guided heroes. To perform the rites, he needed pure water for the lustral libations. He dispatched his companions to a nearby spring, the Spring of Ares, located in a dense grove. His men did not return. Growing anxious, Cadmus went to investigate. He arrived at the spring to a horrifying sight. The bodies of his companions lay strewn about, mangled and lifeless. Guarding the spring was a monstrous serpent, or dragon, with fiery eyes, a venomous crest, and multiple rows of teeth. This creature was sacred to Ares, the god of war, some tales even claiming it was his son. It had fiercely defended its territory against the intruders. Grief-stricken and enraged by the loss of his loyal friends, Cadmus, though alone, did not hesitate. Armed with his sword and javelin, and perhaps a lion's skin for a shield, he engaged the monstrous serpent in a ferocious battle. The serpent coiled and lunged, its venomous fangs snapping, its powerful body attempting to crush him. But Cadmus, displaying immense courage and skill, fought valiantly. After a desperate struggle, he managed to drive his javelin through the creature's neck, pinning it to an oak tree, or crushed its head with a mighty blow from a rock. The sacred serpent of Ares lay dead. As Cadmus stood over his vanquished foe, contemplating his victory and his losses, the goddess Athena appeared before him. She praised his bravery, but then gave him a startling instruction. He was to extract the serpent's teeth and sow them into the earth, like seeds. Though bewildered, Cadmus obeyed. He plowed a furrow in the rich Boeotian soil and carefully planted the dragon's teeth. From the earth, a terrifying harvest sprang forth. Fully armed warriors, their bronze armor glinting, their expressions fierce. These were the Spartoi, the sown men. Without a word, they turned on each other, engaging in a furious battle. Cadmus, horrified by this sudden eruption of violence, was advised by Athena, or by his own quick thinking, to throw a stone amongst them. The Spartoi, each believing another had thrown it, redirected their aggression, and the slaughter intensified until only 5 remained. These 5 survivors, Echion, Eudaeus, Chthonius, Hyperenor, and Pelorus, weary of bloodshed, pledged their allegiance to Cadmus. They would become his loyal comrades and the progenitors of the Theban nobility, helping him to build the citadel of his new city, which he named the Cadmea, the foundation of the future great city of Thebes. However, killing Ares' sacred serpent, even in self-defense, was a grave offense against the formidable god of war. Would you like me to narrate another script? To atone for this act, Cadmus was forced to serve Ares as a bondsman for a period of 8 great years, a long year in divine reckoning, equivalent to many mortal years. He endured this penance with fortitude. Upon the completion of his servitude, the gods, perhaps recognizing his virtue and the fated nature of his actions, decided to honor him. In a remarkable reconciliation, Ares himself agreed to give Cadmus his own daughter, Harmonia, as a bride. Harmonia was the child of Ares and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, a union that itself blended the contrasting forces of strife and desire. The wedding of Cadmus and Harmonia was one of the most splendid occasions in mythological history, attended by all the Olympian gods and goddesses who descended from their celestial home to honor the mortal hero and the divine bride. They brought magnificent gifts. Apollo played the lyre, the muses sang, and Demeter gifted them grain, symbolizing prosperity. However, among these wondrous presents was one that carried a hidden, terrible curse. Hephaestus, the lame smith god, still nursing bitterness over Aphrodite's long and flagrant affair with Ares, presented Harmonia with a divinely wrought necklace of exquisite beauty, and in some versions a robe as well. This necklace, shimmering with gold and jewels, had been imbued by Hephaestus with a malevolent power. It would bring disaster and suffering to whoever possessed it and to their descendants. This was his subtle, long-term revenge upon the offspring of his unfaithful wife and her lover. Unaware of the doom woven into its delicate craftsmanship, Cadmus and Harmonia accepted the gift. They ruled Thebes with wisdom and justice for many years. Cadmus was credited with introducing the Phoenician alphabet to Greece, a monumental contribution to Hellenic civilization, facilitating writing, record-keeping, and the flourishing of literature and learning. They brought order and culture to their new city. They had several children, a son, Polydorus, and 4 daughters, Autono, Ino, Semele, and Agave. Yet the shadow of the cursed necklace and the lingering consequences of divine entanglements loomed large over their family. Each of their children would meet a tragic end. Autono's son, Actaeon, would be torn apart by his own hounds after accidentally seeing Artemis bathing. Ino, driven mad by Hera, would kill her own children and leap into the sea. Later deified as Leucothea, Semele, tricked by Hera, would be incinerated after demanding to see Zeus in his full divine glory, though she would bear Zeus's son Dionysus before her death. Agave, in a Bacchic frenzy induced by Dionysus, would participate in the dismemberment of her own son, King Pentheus of Thebes, who resisted the god's cult. The weight of these accumulated family tragedies eventually became too much for Cadmus and Harmonia to bear. Burdened by sorrow, and perhaps feeling the oppressive atmosphere of Thebes, the city founded on dragons' teeth and divine wrath, they abdicated their throne in favor of their grandson Pentheus, before his own grim fate, or their son Polydorus, and journeyed far to the north, to the land of the Encheleans in Illyria. There, they ruled for a time, and Cadmus even led the Encheleans in victorious battles against other Illyrian tribes. But peace remained elusive. In their old age, reflecting on their lives and the seemingly relentless misfortunes that had plagued them, Cadmus lamented that if the gods were so offended by the slaying of a mere serpent, he wished he himself had been turned into one. As if his words were a prayer, both he and Harmonia were transformed into great, harmless serpents with azure crests. In this serpentine form, some say they were eventually taken by Zeus to the Elysian Fields, a paradise for heroes, suggesting a final, merciful release from their earthly sorrows and a recognition of their fundamental virtue despite the curses that had haunted their lineage. Their transformation also served as a potent symbol, linking the founders of Thebes back to the chthonic, serpentine forces that lay beneath the foundations of their city. The legacy of Cadmus was thus a complex one. A civilizing hero, a bringer of letters, the founder of a great city, yet also the progenitor of a tragically cursed royal line, whose descendants would play out some of the most harrowing dramas in all of Greek mythology, many of them centered on the ill-fated city of Thebes. The cursed necklace of Harmonia would continue its malevolent journey down through the generations, a tangible reminder of divine retribution and the inescapable reach of fate. Such interventions, born of divine desire and leading to far-reaching consequences, were not limited to the lineage of Agenor or the continent that would bear Europa's name. In Argos, a city of ancient dignity in the Peloponnese, whose river Inachus was its lifeblood, and whose people traced their origins to the very dawn of mortal settlement, another drama unfolded, one that would etch itself deeply into the mythological landscape, driven by the same insatiable passions of the king of the gods and the equally potent wrath of his queen. The protagonist of this sorrowful tale was Io, a princess of Argos, daughter of the river god Inachus himself, and a priestess in the temple of Hera. Her beauty was remarkable, a luminous grace that, like Europa's, did not escape the ever-watchful eye of Zeus. Zeus, captivated by Io's innocent charm, began to pursue her. He sent enticing dreams to her maiden bed, visions promising her the love of the greatest of gods and urging her to meet him in the meadows of Lerna, a nearby region famed for its springs and later for the Hydra. Io, troubled and confused by these divine solicitations, confided in her father, Inachus. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" The river god, deeply concerned, consulted the oracles of Delphi and Dodona. The responses were stark and terrifying. Io must yield to Zeus, or the god, in his frustration, would unleash his thunderbolts and obliterate Inachus's entire race and kingdom. Faced with such a dire ultimatum, a grieving Inachus had no choice but to banish his beloved daughter from her home, compelling her towards the fate the gods had decreed. Thus, Io found herself in the appointed meadows, where Zeus, descending from Olympus, enveloped the entire area in a thick, impenetrable cloud, a swirling gray mist designed to hide his amorous encounter from the prying eyes of the world, and most particularly from Hera. But Hera, Queen of Heaven, was no fool. Her millennia of marriage to Zeus had made her preternaturally sensitive to his infidelities. Observing the unnatural, localized cloud blanketing the Argive plains on an otherwise clear day, her suspicions were immediately aroused. She descended swiftly from Olympus, her heart already cold with suspicion. Parting the mist with her divine will, she confronted her husband. Zeus, caught in the act, or very nearly so, thought quickly, if not wisely. In a desperate attempt to conceal his transgression, he transformed Io in the blink of an eye into a beautiful, sleek white heifer. When Hera arrived, she found Zeus standing innocently beside the lovely animal, which he claimed had just sprung forth from the earth. Hera, however, was far from deceived. She admired the heifer extravagantly, praising its flawless white coat and gentle eyes, and then, with a disarmingly sweet smile, asked Zeus if he might give her this wondrous creature as a gift. Zeus was caught in a terrible bind. To refuse such a seemingly innocent request would be a clear admission of guilt, and would undoubtedly provoke Hera's full fury. Yet to surrender Io, now in this vulnerable animal form, to his jealous wife was to condemn the girl to certain torment. Torn, but fearing Hera's immediate wrath more than the long-term consequences for Io, Zeus reluctantly agreed. The beautiful white heifer was now Hera's property. Hera, triumphant and vindictive, wasted no time in securing her prize. She knew that Zeus might attempt to rescue Io if given the chance. Therefore, she entrusted the transformed princess to the keeping of a formidable guardian, Argus Panoptes, the all-seeing. Argus was a primordial giant, a son of Gaia or Arestor, depending on the tradition, and his most terrifying attribute was his multitude of eyes. Accounts vary on the exact number. Some say 50, others 100, scattered all over his body. These eyes never all slept at once. While some rested, others remained wide awake and watchful, making him the perfect, inescapable jailer. Argus tethered the unfortunate Io heifer to an olive tree in a sacred grove at Nemea, or Mycenae, and kept his relentless vigil. Io's suffering was immense. Trapped in an animal's body, she could not speak to express her anguish or plead for help. Did you find the narration clear and engaging? She was forced to graze on bitter herbs and drink muddy water. When she tried to stretch out her arms in supplication to Argus, she found she had no arms. When she tried to cry out her name, Only a mournful, lowing sound emerged from her throat, a sound that terrified her. One day, she wandered to the banks of her father's river, Icarus. The river god and her naiad sisters did not recognize her in her bovine form. In despair, Io traced her name, Io, in the dust with her hoof. Inachus, realizing the horrifying truth of his daughter's fate, was overcome with grief, lamenting his loss and the cruelty of the gods. But his sorrow could offer no solace to Io, and Argus soon drove her away from her family, continuing his unblinking watch. From his Olympian throne, Zeus witnessed Io's misery, and his heart was finally moved to pity, or perhaps guilt. He could no longer bear to see the innocent girl he had desired suffer so terribly. He summoned his cleverest son, Hermes, the divine messenger, renowned for his cunning, stealth, and eloquence. Zeus tasked Hermes with a perilous mission, to outwit Argus and rescue Io. Hermes, ever ready for a challenge, descended to Earth, disguised as a shepherd. He approached Argus, playing enchanting melodies on his newly invented syrinx, the panpipes, made from reeds of varying lengths. Argus, who had a rustic appreciation for music, was captivated. Hermes sat down beside the giant, continuing to play his soothing tunes and telling long, rambling stories, tales designed to induce drowsiness. Slowly, painstakingly, one by one, Argus's many eyes began to close. Hermes played on, his music becoming ever more soporific, his voice a gentle drone, until finally all of Argus Panoptes' eyes were shut in a profound slumber. Seizing his moment, Hermes drew his sharp, sickle-shaped sword, the Harpy, and swiftly beheaded the sleeping giant, or, in some versions, slew him with a well-aimed stone. Thus, Hermes earned the epithet Argifontes, the slayer of Argus. Hera was incandescent with rage when she discovered Argus slain and Io missing. Her carefully laid plan had been thwarted. As a tribute to her loyal servant, she gathered up Argus's myriad eyes and set them into the tail feathers of her sacred bird, the peacock, giving it its magnificent star-patterned plumage, a perpetual reminder of her watchful nature and the giant's sacrifice. But her vengeance against Io was far from over. She conjured a tormenting gadfly, a stinging insect whose bite inflicted excruciating pain and madness, and sent it to relentlessly pursue the liberated heifer. Driven insane by the gadfly's constant, agonizing stings, Io, still in her heifer form, embarked on a desperate, pain-fueled flight across the known world. Her wanderings were vast and torturous. She galloped across Greece, and the sea she plunged into on her westward journey would thereafter be known as the Ionian Sea in her memory. She crossed the straits that would later bear the name Bosporus, the Cow's Ford, linking Europe and Asia. She roamed through the wild, desolate lands of Scythia, north of the Black Sea, enduring harsh climates and savage terrains, the gadfly, ever buzzing, ever stinging, allowing her no rest, no peace. In the course of her tormented journey, Io reached the remote, storm-lashed Caucasus Mountains. There, chained to a desolate crag, she encountered another victim of Zeus's wrath, the Titan Prometheus. Prometheus, enduring his own eternal agony, recognized the divine cause of Io's suffering. Despite his pain, he spoke kindly to her, offering what comfort he could. Io, through her sorrowful lowing and gestures, communicated her plight. Prometheus, gifted with foresight, prophesied her future. He told her that her wanderings were far from over. She would journey through Asia, encounter fierce tribes like the Chalybes, the Amazons, and the Griffins guarding gold, before finally reaching the land of Egypt and the life-giving Nile River. There, he foretold, Zeus himself would finally end her torment, restoring her to human form with a gentle touch of his hand. She would then bear a son named Epaphus, he of the touch, who would become a great king and the ancestor of a mighty lineage. And, in a prophecy that offered Prometheus himself a glimmer of hope, he revealed that one of Io's distant descendants, a great hero, Hercules, would eventually come to the Caucasus and free him from his chains. Heartened, if daunted, by Prometheus's words, Io resumed her agonizing flight, the gadfly still her relentless pursuer. She traversed vast distances, through deserts and mountains driven by pain and madness, until at long last, weary beyond measure, she reached the fertile delta of the Nile in Egypt. There, as Prometheus had foretold, her ordeal came to an end. Zeus, seeing her profound suffering and her arrival at the destined place, appeared. With a single compassionate touch of his divine hand, he healed her, restored her to her human form, and freed her from the gadfly's torment. The transformation was complete. Io was a woman once more, though forever marked by her incredible journey and suffering. In Egypt, Io gave birth to Zeus's son, Epaphus. He grew to become a respected king of Egypt, credited with founding the city of Memphis. Io herself was greatly honored by the Egyptians, who, according to some Greek writers like Herodotus, identified her with their own great goddess Isis, often depicted with cow horns, a symbol of motherhood and fertility. Through Epaphus, Io became the ancestress of many prominent figures in Greek mythology, including Danaus and Aegyptus, whose descendants would feature in the sagas of Argos, and, many generations later, the greatest of all Greek heroes, Heracles, who would indeed fulfill Prometheus' prophecy and liberate the Titan. Thus, the tale of Io, which began with divine lust and deception, ended with a measure of peace and the establishment of significant royal lines. Would you like me to narrate another script? Her suffering underscored the perils faced by mortals caught in the desires and disputes of the gods, particularly the relentless nature of Hera's jealousy. Yet her endurance and eventual salvation also spoke to a possibility of ultimate redemption, even after profound suffering. Her journey across the world left its mark on geography and memory, a testament to a princess who, transformed and tormented, wandered to the very ends of the earth, before finding solace and becoming a foremother of heroes. The peacock's tail remained a vibrant reminder of Argus's fate, and the name Argiphantes a permanent addition to Hermes' long list of epithets, a testament to his cunning service to his father, Zeus. The complex web of divine actions and their mortal repercussions continued to expand, shaping the destinies of individuals, cities, and entire peoples across the Hellenic world and beyond. The gods, it was clear, were intimately involved in the human story, their interventions capable of bringing both unimaginable sorrow and unexpected glory. While the Argive plain recovered from the divine drama of Io, and the Theban citadel stood as a monument to Cadmus's perseverance, other regions of Greece were also witnessing the establishment of their own foundational myths and royal lines, often intertwined with the Olympian deities. In Attica, the land that would one day be dominated by the glorious city of Athens, the earliest beginnings were equally steeped in divine parentage and peculiar births. The very first king of Athens, according to some traditions, was Cecrops, a figure born from the earth itself, an autochthon. He was said to have a dual nature, human from the waist up, but with a serpent's tail for his lower half, symbolizing his deep connection to the Attic soil. Cecrops was credited with many civilizing acts, establishing marriage, instituting the first census, dividing Attica into 12 communities, and promoting the worship of Zeus and Athena. It was during his reign, or shortly thereafter, that the famous contest for the patronage of Attica took place between Athena and Poseidon. Both deities desired to be the chief patron of this promising land. To settle the dispute, they agreed to a contest, to be judged by Cecrops, or sometimes by the Olympian gods themselves, or the 12 gods of the Attic pantheon. They met on the Acropolis, the high, rocky outcrop that would become the Sacred Heart of Athens. Poseidon was the first to present his gift. Striking the rock of the Acropolis with his mighty trident, he caused a spring of salt water to gush forth, symbolizing maritime power and access to the sea. Some versions say he produced the first horse, a creature of speed and warfare. Athena, in her turn, calmly touched the ground with her spear, and from the earth sprang a verdant olive tree, its branches laden with fruit. This tree represented peace, prosperity, agriculture, and the vital olive oil that would become a cornerstone of the Attic economy and culture. Would you like me to narrate another segment? Cecrops, or the assembled divine judges, deemed Athena's gift to be the more beneficial and valuable to the people of Attica. The olive tree offered sustenance, oil for lamps and anointing, and wood, whereas Poseidon's saltwater spring was of limited use, and the horse, while valuable, was more associated with war than with enduring prosperity. Thus, Athena was declared the victor, and the city was named Athens in her honor. She became its protector goddess, and the olive tree became her sacred symbol, with the descendant of that original tree always carefully tended on the Acropolis. Poseidon, angered by his defeat, was said to have flooded the Thriasian plain of Attica in retribution, or to have maintained a contentious relationship with the city for some time, though eventually he too was honored with significant worship in Athens, particularly at Sanion. This contest myth not only explained the city's name and its primary divine patron, but also highlighted the core values: wisdom, craftsmanship, and peaceful prosperity that Athens aspired to embody. The early lineage of Athenian kings continued with figures born under equally strange and divine circumstances. After Cecrops, or perhaps succeeding Cranaus, another autochthonous king, came Erichthonius. His conception was unusual. Hephaestus, the smith god, overcome with desire for Athena, attempted to embrace her. Athena, the virgin goddess, fiercely repelled his advances. In the struggle, Hephaestus' seed fell upon Athena's thigh. Disgusted, she wiped it off with a piece of wool, Arion, and threw it to the earth, Chthon. From this union of divine seed and fertile earth, Erichthonius was born. Gaia, the earth, effectively served as his surrogate mother. Athena, feeling a sense of responsibility for the child, took him into her care. She placed the infant Erichthonius in a sacred chest and entrusted him to the three daughters of Cecrops, Herse, Pandrosus, and Aglaurus, with strict instructions never to open the box. Driven by curiosity, however, two of the sisters, Herse and Aglaurus, Pandrosus remained faithful, disobeyed Athena's command. They peeked inside the chest and were met with a terrifying sight. The infant, Erichthonius, was either guarded by two live serpents or his lower body was serpentine, much like Cecrops. The shock of this discovery, or perhaps the wrath of Athena manifested, drove the disobedient sisters mad, and they flung themselves to their deaths from the cliffs of the Acropolis. Athena then raised Erichthonius herself, some say within her temple. He grew up to become a wise king of Athens, credited with founding the Panathenaic festival in Athena's honor and with teaching his people to yoke horses to chariots. He, like Cecrops, was deeply connected to the earth and the protective power of Athena, further solidifying the city's identity and its divine affiliations. The serpent imagery associated with these early Athenian kings symbolized their autochthonous origins, their chthonic power, and their intimate link to the land they ruled, a powerful claim to legitimacy and indigenous sovereignty. These foundational stories, woven from divine interventions, peculiar births, and acts of primal piety and transgression, laid the groundwork for the future glories and complex history of Athens, a city destined to become a beacon of philosophy, democracy, and art, all under the watchful eye of its namesake goddess. While Athens was thus laying its mythic foundations, another great island civilization, Crete, was also experiencing the profound and often perilous consequences of divine favor and royal ambition, largely through the figure of Minos, that son of Zeus and Europa, whom the divine bull had carried across the sea. After Zeus departed, Europa had married Asterion, the king of Crete, who adopted Minos and his brothers Rhadamanthus and Sarpedon. Upon Asterion's death, a dispute arose among the brothers for the throne. Minos claimed the kingship by divine right, asserting that the gods would grant any prayer he made. To prove this, he prayed to Poseidon, lord of the sea, to send a magnificent bull from the depths, vowing to sacrifice the creature immediately in the god's honor. Poseidon, obliging, caused a splendid white bull, more beautiful than any mortal beast, to emerge from the churning waves. The Cretans were awestruck, and Minos' claim to the throne was secured. However, the bull was so extraordinarily beautiful, its hide so pure and its form so perfect, that Minos, overcome by avarice or aesthetic admiration, found himself unable to fulfill his vow. He decided to keep the magnificent animal for his own herds and sacrificed the lesser bull from his own stock in its place, hoping Poseidon would not notice or would overlook the substitution. This was a grave miscalculation. The gods, especially one as powerful and proud as Poseidon, did not take kindly to broken vows and deceit. The sea god's retribution was swift, subtle, and terrible, aimed not directly at Minos, but through his family, striking at the heart of his pride and household. Poseidon afflicted Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, who was a daughter of Helios the sun god and the Oceanid nymph Perse, making her a sorceress of considerable power in her own right. The god instilled in her an overwhelming and unnatural passion, a maddening lust for the very bull Minos had refused to sacrifice. Consumed by this divinely inflicted desire, Pasiphae languished, her thoughts consumed by the creature. She adorned herself as if for a lover, yet found no solace. She grew to hate other cows for their beauty, ordering them slaughtered. She roamed the pastures, her eyes fixed on the magnificent white bull, her mind tormented by an impossible longing. In her desperation, Pasiphae sought the aid of Daedalus, the most ingenious craftsman and inventor of the age. Daedalus was an Athenian exile, having fled his native city after jealously murdering his own nephew and apprentice, Talos, or Perdix, whose inventive genius threatened to surpass his own. He had found refuge and patronage at King Minos' court in Knossos. Understanding Pasiphae's plight, or perhaps compelled by her royal command and magical influence, Daedalus agreed to help her satisfy her unnatural desire. He constructed an incredibly lifelike hollow wooden cow, covered with a real cow's hide, and mounted it on wheels. He placed Pasiphae inside this convincing decoy and wheeled it into the meadow where the divine bull grazed. The bull, deceived by the craftsmanship, approached and mated with the wooden effigy containing the queen. From this monstrous union, Pasiphae conceived and, in due course, gave birth to a creature of horror, the Minotaur. His true name was Asterion, after Minos' adoptive father, but he became universally known as the Minotaur, meaning, quote, of Minos. This being had the body of a powerful man, but the head and tail of a bull. He was a savage, man-eating monster, a living testament to Pasiphae's shame and Poseidon's terrible revenge. King Minos was horrified and disgraced by the creature's birth, but could not bring himself to kill it, perhaps due to some lingering paternal connection or fear of further divine wrath. Instead, he once again turned to Daedalus, commanding the craftsman to devise a way to conceal this monstrous offspring and the scandal it represented. Daedalus, with his unparalleled skill, designed and constructed the labyrinth, a vast and intricate maze of winding passages, blind alleys, and confusing turns, so complex that once inside, no one could find their way out without guidance. It was a marvel of engineering, built beneath the palace of Knossos. Within the lightless heart of this inescapable prison, the Minotaur was confined, fed on human flesh to satisfy its unnatural hunger. The secret of the labyrinth and its terrible inhabitant was closely guarded. Some years later, Minos' son, Androgeos, traveled to Athens to participate in the Panathenaic Games. A gifted athlete, Androgeos triumphed in every contest, incurring the jealousy of Agis, the king of Athens, or perhaps of local youths. Fearing his prowess or suspecting treachery, Aegeus or the Athenians arranged for Androgeos' death, either by sending him against the untamable Marathonian bull, or by ambushing him on his way to Thebes. When news of his son's murder reached Minos, his grief was immense and his wrath terrible. He assembled his powerful Cretan fleet and waged war against Athens. The war was devastating for the Athenians, who were also afflicted by plague and famine sent by the gods in response to the unjust killing. Defeated and desperate, the Athenians consulted the Oracle of Delphi, which instructed them to appease Minos and accept whatever terms he might impose. Minos, still grieving and vengeful, dictated a cruel tribute. Every 9 years, Athens was to send 7 of its noblest youths and 7 of its most beautiful maidens to Crete. Is there anything else I can help you with? There, these 14 young Athenians would be unarmed and cast into the labyrinth as sacrifices to the Minotaur. This horrifying tribute ensured a steady supply of victims for the monster and served as a bitter, ongoing reminder of Athenian submission to Cretan power. Twice the dreadful tribute had been paid, and the time for the third was approaching. The city of Athens was plunged into mourning and despair each time the black-sailed ship prepared to depart for Crete. It was then that Theseus, the heroic son of King Aegeus, or secretly of Poseidon, who had recently arrived in Athens and been acknowledged as heir, volunteered himself as one of the 7 youths. Despite Aegeus' desperate pleas, Theseus was determined to sail to Crete, slay the Minotaur, and end the abhorrent tribute once and for all. He promised his father that if he returned victorious, he would replace the ship's black sail of mourning with a white sail of triumph. Upon arrival in Crete, the Athenian youths and maidens were paraded before King Minos. It was then that Minos' daughter Ariadne first saw Theseus. Struck by his heroic bearing and noble demeanor, she fell deeply in love with him. Unable to bear the thought of him being devoured by her monstrous half-brother, Ariadne resolved to help him. She secretly approached Theseus, offering her assistance on the condition that if he survived, he would take her away from Crete and marry her. Theseus readily agreed. Following the counsel of Daedalus, whom Ariadne had consulted, or perhaps Daedalus approached her directly, pitying the victims or seeking to undermine Minos, Ariadne provided Theseus with 2 crucial items: a sharp sword to fight the Minotaur, and a clue or ball of thread. She instructed him to tie one end of the thread to the entrance of the labyrinth, and unwind it as he ventured deeper into the maze. This way, if he survived the encounter with the Minotaur, he could find his way back out. Theseus, armed with the sword and clutching the vital thread, bravely entered the labyrinth. He navigated its bewildering passages, the thread marking his path, until he reached the dark central chamber where the Minotaur dwelled. A ferocious battle ensued. The Minotaur, with its brute strength and savage fury, charged at Theseus. But the hero, quick and skillful, fought with courage and cunning. Using the sword given to him by Ariadne, he eventually overpowered and slew the beast, some say by stabbing it in the throat, others by tearing off one of its horns and using it as a weapon, or simply by beating it to death with his fists after a long struggle. His victory echoed through the silent, twisting corridors. Following Ariadne's thread, Theseus successfully navigated his way out of the labyrinth, leading his fellow Athenian tributes, who had been hidden or spared, back to safety and freedom. True to his word, Theseus took Ariadne with him as he and the rescued Athenians set sail from Crete, fleeing under the cover of night after perhaps disabling Minos' ships. Their journey, however, took an unexpected and tragic turn for Ariadne. They landed on the island of Dia, more commonly identified as Naxos. There, for reasons much debated by ancient and modern scholars, Theseus abandoned Ariadne while she slept. Some say Athena or Hermes ordered him to do so in a dream, as Ariadne was destined for another. Others suggest Theseus was simply faithless, or perhaps he feared bringing a Cretan princess, daughter of his enemy, back to Athens. Whatever the reason, Ariadne awoke to find herself alone and deserted on a strange shore, her heart broken by Theseus's betrayal. Her despair, however, was not to last indefinitely. The god Dionysus, patron of wine and ecstasy, found her weeping on Naxos, was captivated by her beauty, and made her his divine consort. He gifted her a magnificent crown, the Corona Borealis, which was later set among the stars. Meanwhile, Theseus continued his voyage back to Athens. In his haste, or perhaps his grief over abandoning Ariadne, or simply out of forgetfulness, he tragically failed to change the ship's black sail to white, as he had promised his father. King Aegeus, anxiously watching from the cliffs of the Acropolis day after day, saw the black-sailed ship approaching in the distance. Leaving his son to be dead, consumed by grief, Aegeus threw himself from the cliffs into the sea, which thereafter was named the Aegean Sea in his memory. Theseus thus returned to Athens a hero, the savior of his city from the Cretan tribute, but also a grieving son, who inadvertently caused his father's death. He became the king of Athens, a great unifier and lawgiver, but his early heroism was forever tinged with this personal tragedy. Back in Crete, King Minos was enraged by the escape of the Athenian tributes, the death of the Minotaur, and the treachery of his daughter Ariadne, all facilitated by the genius of Daedalus. Realizing Daedalus's role in these events, Minos imprisoned the craftsman and his young son Icarus within the labyrinth itself, or, in some versions, in a high tower. Daedalus, the master inventor, was not one to remain captive for long. He observed the flight of birds and conceived a daring plan for escape. Using feathers of various sizes, he bound them together with thread at their middles and wax at their bases, carefully shaping them into two pairs of large, functional wings, one for himself and one for Icarus. Before they took flight, Daedalus gave his son solemn instructions. "Icarus, my son," he said, "I warn you to fly a middle course. If you fly too low, the damp from the sea will clog your wings. If you fly too high, the sun's heat will melt the wax that holds the feathers. Fly between the two, and follow my lead." With these words, he fitted the wings onto Icarus and then onto himself. They launched themselves into the air, Daedalus leading the way, Icarus following. Fishermen, shepherds, and plowmen below looked up in astonishment, believing them to be gods soaring through the sky. For a time, all went well. They flew over Samos, Delos, and Paros. But Icarus, young and exhilarated by the novel sensation of flight, grew reckless. Forgetting his father's warnings, he began to soar upwards, exulting in his newfound power, drawn by a desire to reach the heavens. As he flew closer to the sun, the intense heat softened the fragrant wax that held his feathers. The feathers loosened and began to fall away. Icarus flapped his bare arms frantically, but with no feathers to catch the air, he plummeted downwards, crying out his father's name, until he plunged into the sea and drowned. Daedalus, hearing his son's cries, looked back and saw only scattered feathers floating on the waves. Heartbroken, he circled, found Icarus's body, and carried it to a nearby island. which he named Icaria in his son's memory. He buried Icarus there, cursing his own inventive genius that had led to such a tragedy. The sea where Icarus fell also became known as the Icarian Sea. Daedalus himself continued his flight, eventually reaching safety in Camicus, Sicily, where he found refuge at the court of King Cocalus. Minos, however, was relentless in his pursuit of the craftsman. He knew Daedalus's genius and devised a clever plan to find him. Minos traveled from city to city, carrying a spiral seashell and offering a great reward to anyone who could pass a thread through its intricate whorls. He knew that only Daedalus would be clever enough to solve such a puzzle. When Minos arrived in Sicily and presented the challenge to King Cocalus, Cocalus, eager for the reward, secretly gave the shell to Daedalus. Daedalus tied the thread to an ant, made a small hole at the apex of the shell, and smeared honey at the opening. The ant, drawn by the honey, crawled through the winding passages of the shell, pulling the thread with it. When Cocalus returned the threaded shell to Minos, the Cretan king knew immediately that Daedalus was within Cocalus's palace. He demanded that the craftsman be surrendered. King Cocalus promised to comply, but invited Minos to a banquet and a bath first, feigning hospitality. While Minos was bathing, unarmed and vulnerable, the daughters of Cocalus, persuaded by Daedalus, or fiercely loyal to their guest who had crafted wondrous toys for them, or simply acting on their father's orders to protect his valuable asset, murdered the mighty king of Crete by pouring boiling water or oil over him. Thus ended the life of Minos, son of Zeus, king of Crete, husband of Pasiphae, father of the Minotaur, Androgeos, and Ariadne. Was the narration satisfactory? After his death, due to his reputation as a just lawgiver during his reign, despite his later tyranny, Minos, along with his brother Rhadamanthus and Arachus of Aegina, became one of the 3 judges of the dead in the underworld, determining the fate of souls. The power of Crete waned after his death, and the island's great palaces eventually fell into ruin, though its myths of bulls and labyrinths, of ingenious craftsmen and tragic flights continued to echo through the ages. Profound meditations on divine power, human hubris, creativity, and the inescapable bonds of fate. Daedalus, for his part, was said to have lived out his days in Sicily or Sardinia, continuing to create wonders, but forever shadowed by the loss of his son. The ripples of these Cretan events spread far, influencing art, literature, and the very psyche of the ancient world, a testament to the enduring power of these epic tales. And indeed, while the echoes of Cretan bulls and Athenian heroes resonated across the Aegean, the city of Thebes, founded upon dragon's teeth by Cadmus, was breeding its own particularly dark strain of epic tragedy, a testament to the enduring power of curses and the inescapable decrees of fate. The shadow of the necklace of Harmonia, that beautiful, doomed gift, hung heavy over the royal house, its malevolent influence seeping down through the generations, ensuring that the descendants of Cadmus and Harmonia would know little lasting peace. Though Polydorus, son of Cadmus, had ruled, and his line continued, it was through Laius, a great-grandson of Cadmus, that the curse would find its most infamous expression. Laius inherited the throne of Thebes, but his path to kingship was not straightforward, and his early actions sowed seeds of future disaster. During a period of exile before becoming king, Laius was offered hospitality by Pelops, king of Pisa in Elis. In a gross violation of Xenia, the sacred bond of guest friendship, Laius abducted and, in some versions, raped Pelops' beautiful young son Chrysippus. Pelops, enraged and grief-stricken, laid a terrible curse upon Laius, that he should either die childless, or if he did have a son, that son would kill him and marry his own wife. This curse, born of a mortal's outrage but potent enough to align with the overarching doom of his house, would prove chillingly accurate. Upon eventually ascending the Theban throne, Laius married Jocasta, sometimes called Epicasta, a descendant of the Spartoi, those earthborn warriors who had helped Cadmus found the city. For many years they remained childless, a fact Laius perhaps initially welcomed, mindful of Pelops' curse. However, the desire for an heir, a common anxiety for ancient kings, eventually led him to consult the Oracle of Delphi. Apollo's pronouncement was unambiguous and terrifying. Laius was fated to be killed by his own son, and that son would then marry his own mother. Horrified, Laius resolved to avoid siring any children, but fate, or perhaps a moment of drunken forgetfulness and passion, intervened. Jocasta conceived. Is there anything else I can help with? When the child, a boy, was born, Laius and Jocasta, desperate to avert the prophecy, could not bring themselves to kill their infant son outright. Instead, they pierced and pinned his ankles together, some say with a nail or a stake, a cruel act that would give him his future name, and ordered a loyal shepherd to expose the baby on Mount Cithaeron, leaving him to die from the elements or be devoured by wild beasts. The shepherd, however, took pity on the helpless infant. Instead of abandoning him to certain death, he gave the baby to a fellow shepherd from Corinth, who happened to be tending his flocks on the same mountain. This Corinthian shepherd, in turn, presented the child to his own king and queen, Polybus and Merope of Corinth, who were childless and longed for an heir. They adopted the boy, named him Oedipus, meaning swollen foot, on account of his injured ankles, and raised him as their own beloved son and prince, never revealing his true origins. Oedipus grew into a strong, intelligent, and capable young man in Corinth, believing himself to be the true son of Polymestais and Merope. However, one day at a banquet, a drunken companion taunted him, claiming he was not his father's son. Though Polybus and Merope reassured him, a seed of doubt was planted in Oedipus's mind. Troubled and seeking to learn the truth of his parentage, Oedipus, like Laius before him, journeyed to Delphi to consult the oracle of Apollo. He asked about his birth, but the god gave him no direct answer about his parents. Instead, the Pythia delivered a horrifying prophecy. Oedipus was doomed to kill his father and marry his mother. Appalled by this terrible fate, and still believing Polybos and Merope to be his true parents, Oedipus resolved never to return to Corinth, lest he inadvertently fulfill the oracle's dreadful words. He turned his back on the city he considered home, and set out on a path leading away from Corinth towards Thebes. As he traveled, he came to a narrow place where three roads met, a place called the Phocian Crossroads. At this very spot, a chariot approached from the opposite direction, carrying an older nobleman and his retinue. The herald leading the chariot arrogantly ordered Oedipus to step aside and make way for his master. Oedipus, proud and quick-tempered, refused. An argument ensued, escalating quickly to violence. The nobleman in the chariot, who was none other than King Laius of Thebes, Oedipus's biological father, struck Oedipus with his goad or whip. Enraged, Oedipus fought back with furious strength, killing the herald, the driver, and the old king himself, unaware of their identities. Only one attendant escaped to carry the news of the king's death back to Thebes, reporting that a band of robbers had ambushed and slain them. Thus, the first part of the prophecy was fulfilled. Oedipus had killed his father. Would you like me to read another script? Continuing his journey, Oedipus arrived at the city of Thebes. He found the city in a state of profound distress, terrorized by a monstrous creature called the Sphinx. This Sphinx, a winged beast with the body of a lioness and the head and breast of a woman, had been sent by Hera, or perhaps Apollo or Dionysus in some versions, to plague Thebes as punishment for Laius's past transgressions, or simply as a test of the city's mettle. Perched on a rock outside the city gates, or on Mount Phocium, the Sphinx posed a riddle to all who wished to enter or leave Thebes. Those who could not answer were brutally devoured. The riddle, taught to her by the Muses, was, what is it that walks on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet at noon, and 3 feet in the evening? Many Thebans had already perished, and the city was desperate. Creon, Jocasta's brother, who had become regent after Laius's death, proclaimed that whoever could solve the Sphinx's riddle and free Thebes from its terror would be given the kingship and the hand of the widowed Queen Jocasta in marriage. Oedipus, fearless and confident in his intellect, confronted the Sphinx and listened to her riddle. After a moment's thought, he gave the correct answer. Man, as an infant, he crawls on all fours. In adulthood, he walks on 2 legs. And in old age, he uses a staff as a 3rd leg. Defeated and enraged that her riddle had been solved, the Sphinx, according to most traditions, cast herself from her high rock and perished. Thebes was liberated. Oedipus was hailed as a hero and savior. True to Creon's promise, he was made king of Thebes and married Queen Jocasta, his own biological mother. Thus, the second, even more horrifying part of the prophecy was fulfilled. Oedipus and Jocasta ruled Thebes for many years in apparent peace and prosperity, and they had 4 children, 2 sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and 2 daughters, Antigone and Ismene. The cursed necklace of Harmonia, though perhaps not physically present, continued its work through the invisible threads of fate woven around the royal family. Then, years later, a terrible plague descended upon Thebes. Crops failed, livestock died, women suffered miscarriages, and the city was filled with sickness and death. The desperate Thebans appealed to their king, Oedipus, the man who had saved them once before. Oedipus, a conscientious ruler, sent Creon to Delphi to ask the oracle for guidance. Creon returned with Apollo's message. The plague was a divine punishment for the pollution caused by the presence of Laius's murderer, who was still living unpunished within the city. The gods demanded that the killer be found and either executed or exiled to lift the pestilence. Oedipus, determined to cleanse his city and unaware of his own culpability, zealously took up the investigation. He pronounced a solemn curse upon the unknown murderer, vowing to bring him to justice. He summoned the blind prophet Tiresias, a seer renowned for his wisdom and connection to the gods. Tiresias, knowing the horrifying truth, was initially reluctant to speak, warning Oedipus that the revelation would bring only pain. But Oedipus, angered by the prophet's reticence and suspecting him of complicity or even of plotting with Creon, accused him harshly and insisted he reveal what he knew. Goaded beyond endurance, Tiresias finally declared, "You, Oedipus, are the murderer you seek. You are the defiler of this land." Oedipus, incredulous and enraged, dismissed Tiresias' words as slander, accusing him and Creon of conspiring to usurp his throne. Jocasta, attempting to reassure Oedipus and discredit oracles, told him of the prophecy given to Laius that he would be killed by his own son, and how they had averted it by exposing their infant on Mount Cithaeron. She mentioned that Laius was killed by robbers at a place where 3 roads met. This detail, the 3 roads, struck a chord of terrible recognition in Oedipus. He remembered the encounter at the Phocian crossroads. A dreadful suspicion began to dawn. He questioned Jocasta further about Laius' appearance and the number of his attendants. Her answers deepened his growing horror. At this critical moment, a messenger arrived from Corinth with news that King Polybus had died of old age. Oedipus and Jocasta initially felt a surge of relief, believing this meant the prophecy that Oedipus would kill his father was false. However, the messenger, seeking to further alleviate Oedipus's fears about returning to Corinth, where Merope still lived, and Oedipus still feared the maternal part of the prophecy, revealed a long-held secret. Oedipus was not the biological son of Polybus and Merope. The messenger himself was the Corinthian shepherd who had received the infant Oedipus from another shepherd on Mount Cithaeron, and had given him to the Corinthian king and queen. Jocasta, hearing this, finally understood the full, unbearable truth. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with horrifying clarity. The exposed infant, the prophecy, Laius' death at the crossroads, her marriage to the hero who solved the Sphinx's riddle. Overcome with shame and despair, she rushed into the palace, her fate sealed. Oedipus, still not fully grasping the maternal aspect, pressed on, determined to know the identity of the Theban shepherd who had given him away. He summoned the old shepherd, the sole surviving witness of Laius' murder, who had also been the one tasked with exposing the infant. The shepherd, under duress and the threat of torture, reluctantly confirmed the final devastating piece of the truth. Oedipus was indeed the son of Laius and Jocasta. He had killed his father and married his mother. The prophecies had been fulfilled in every dreadful detail. The revelation shattered Oedipus. He rushed into the palace, calling for Jocasta, perhaps intending to kill her and then himself. He found her in her chambers, having hanged herself in her unbearable shame and grief. Seeing his wife and mother dead, Oedipus, in a paroxysm of agony and self-loathing, took the golden brooches from Jocasta's robe and plunged their pins into his own eyes, blinding himself. He declared that his eyes, which had been blind to the truth for so long, should no longer behold the light of day, nor the faces of his children, who were also his siblings, nor the city he had unknowingly defiled. Blinded and disgraced, Oedipus begged Creon, who had once again become regent, to exile him from Thebes, as he himself had decreed for Laius' murderer. Creon, now more measured, sought guidance from Apollo. The god confirmed that Oedipus must leave Thebes. His sons, Eteocles and Polynices, young and perhaps already vying for power, were content to see him go, an act of filial impiety that Oedipus cursed, prophesying that they too would die at each other's hands, fighting over their inheritance. Accompanied by his devoted daughters, Antigone and Ismene, the blind, exiled king wandered away from Thebes, a broken man, a living symbol of the tragic interplay between fate, free will, and divine justice. His journey would eventually lead him to Colonus, near Athens, where, under the protection of King Theseus, he would find a mysterious and sacred end, his suffering perhaps finally atoning for his unwitting crimes and the curses that had plagued his house. The tragic legacy of Oedipus, however, did not end with his exile. The curse he laid upon his sons, Eteocles and Polynices, ensured that the cycle of strife and bloodshed within the royal house of Thebes would continue with devastating consequences for the next generation. The city, having barely recovered from the plague and the horrifying revelations about its king, was now set on a path towards civil war, as the sons of Oedipus prepared to enact the next chapter in the sorrowful saga of the Labdacids, the ill-fated descendants of Labdacus, father of Laius. The cursed necklace of Harmonia, though its physical whereabouts were often obscure, seemed to have infused its venom into the very soul of Thebes, ensuring that its story would remain one of the most potent and cautionary in all of Greek mythology, a profound exploration of human suffering, guilt, and the terrifying power of the gods. The curse of Oedipus, invoked in his moment of bitterest despair and filial betrayal, was not an idle threat. It settled upon Achilles and Polynices with the inescapable weight of their family's blighted destiny. Upon Oedipus's departure from Thebes, his sons, far from showing remorse or attempting to reconcile their father's spirit, quickly fell into dispute over the throne he had vacated. They initially agreed to rule Thebes in alternate years to avoid conflict. Eteocles, being the elder or perhaps simply more assertive, took the first turn as king. Thebes, under his rule, enjoyed a fragile peace, but the shadow of the agreement loomed. When the year concluded, Eteocles, having tasted power, found himself unwilling to relinquish it. Did you enjoy my narration? He broke his solemn oath to his brother, refused to step down, and, adding insult to injury, drove Polynices into exile from Thebes, stripping him of his birthright and his share of the kingdom. Polynices, now a stateless wanderer, burned with resentment and a thirst for vengeance. He carried with him not only the injustice of his brother's treachery, but also a share of the accursed legacy of their house, including, some say, the fatal necklace of Harmonia, or at least the knowledge of its power, and a desire to use any means necessary to reclaim his position. His wanderings eventually led him south to Argos, a powerful kingdom ruled by King Adrastus. He arrived at Adrastus's palace gates in the dead of night during a fierce storm, seeking shelter. By a strange coincidence, another exile arrived at the very same time, Tydeus, son of Oeneus, king of Calydon. Tydeus was a formidable warrior, but he too was fleeing his homeland, having been banished for shedding kindred blood. The murder of a brother or an uncle accounts vary. The two desperate princes, soaked and exhausted, soon fell into a quarrel outside the palace, their tempers frayed. Their shouts and the clash of their arms roused King Adrastus. When Adrastus came out to investigate the commotion, he beheld a curious sight. Polynices, in his flight from Thebes, bore a shield emblazoned with the image of a lion, while Tydeus, the Caledonian exile, carried a shield depicting a fierce boar. Adrastus recalled an ancient oracle that had advised him to yoke his daughters to a lion and a boar. Seeing these two formidable young men with their symbolic shield devices, he recognized the fulfillment of the prophecy. He welcomed them into his palace, calmed their dispute, and, true to the oracle's interpretation, eventually gave his daughters in marriage, Deipole to Tydeus and Argia to Polynices. With these marriages, Adrastus also pledged his military support to both his new sons-in-law, vowing to help restore them to their respective kingdoms, beginning with Polynices' claim on Thebes. Thus, the stage was set for a great and terrible war. Adrastus, eager to fulfill his promise and perhaps expand his own influence, began to assemble a mighty army, summoning the greatest heroes and chieftains of Argos and its allies. 7 champions were chosen to lead the expedition against the 7 gates of Thebes. First among them was Adrastus himself, a wise and experienced leader, though fated to be the sole survivor of the leading champions, thanks to his divine, swift horse Arion. Second was Polynices, fueled by his righteous anger and determination to reclaim his throne. Third was Tydeus, small in stature but immense in courage and ferocity, a warrior whose battle rage was legendary. Before the main army marched, Tydeus was sent as an envoy to Thebes to demand that Eteocles honor the agreement and surrender the throne to Polynices. Eteocles contemptuously refused. Would you like me to narrate another passage? Tydeus, enraged by the dismissal, challenged the Theban nobles to single combat and, one by one, defeated them all in contests of strength and skill, a display of martial prowess that only hardened Theban resolve and further inflamed hostilities. He barely escaped an ambush of 50 Thebans set for him on his return journey, slaughtering all but one, Maon, whom he allowed to return to Thebes to report the failure. The fourth champion was Capaneus, a giant of a man, immensely strong and possessing an equally immense arrogance. He boasted that not even the lightning of Zeus could stop him from taking Thebes, an impious declaration that would seal his doom. Fifth was Hippomedon, a noble Argive of great valor and stature, often depicted with a fearsome mythological creature on his shield, such as the Lernaean Hydra or Typhon, breathing fire. The sixth was Parthenopaeus of Arcadia, the youthful and strikingly beautiful son of the huntress Atalanta, in either Meleger or Ares. Despite his youth, he was a keen warrior, eager to prove his mettle in battle, sometimes described as an expert archer, his shield often bearing the image of Atalanta herself slaying the Caledonian boar. The seventh champion, however, presented a significant problem. Amphiaraus, the renowned seer of Argos, and brother-in-law to Adrastus, having married his sister Eriphyle. Amphiaraus possessed the gift of prophecy and foresaw clearly that the expedition against Thebes was doomed to fail, and that all the champions, save Adrastus, would perish, himself included. Naturally, he had no desire to participate in such a suicidal venture, and initially refused to join, hiding himself away to avoid being compelled. This created a serious obstacle, as Amphiaraus was not only a great warrior, but also the army's chief prophet, whose guidance was considered essential. Polynices, desperate to secure Amphiaraus' participation, knew of an old agreement between Amphiaraus and Eriphyle. Years before, after a serious dispute between Adrastus and Amphiaraus that nearly led to bloodshed, Eriphyle had reconciled them. At that time, Amphiaraus had sworn an oath that in any future disagreement between himself and Adrastus, he would abide by Eriphyle's decision. Polynices saw his opportunity. He approached Eriphyle with a bribe of irresistible allure, the legendary, divinely wrought Necklace of Harmonia. This was the very same necklace forged by Hephaestus, imbued with a curse to bring misfortune to its owner and their descendants, the same necklace that had played a role in the tragedies of Cadmus's daughters. Whether Polynices had inherited it, taken it from Jocasta's possessions after her death, or it had come into his possession by other means, he now offered this object of fatal beauty to Eriphyle in exchange for her persuading Amphiaraus to join the war. Eriphyle, like many before her, was dazzled by the necklace's exquisite craftsmanship and sinister charm. Blinded by greed and vanity, or perhaps simply unable to resist its inherent corrupting influence, she accepted the bribe. She then invoked the old oath, commanding her husband, Amphiaraus, to join the expedition against Thebes. Amphiaraus, bound by his vow, and knowing his wife had been bought by the cursed gold, was filled with grief and rage. He knew he was marching to his death, and he knew Eriphyle's treachery was the cause. Before departing, he instructed his sons, Alcmaeon and Amphilochus, to avenge his inevitable death by killing their mother once they came of age, and then to lead a second expedition against Thebes, which he prophesied would be successful. With a heavy heart, the seer joined the ranks of the doomed army. The cursed necklace had claimed another victim, weaving its dark thread into the tapestry of Theban fate. With the 7 champions finally assembled, the formidable Argive army, full of hope for victory but shadowed by Amphiaraus' grim prophecies, began its march towards Boeotia and the 7-gated city of Thebes. Their journey was not without incident or ill omen. As they passed through Nemea, in the parched Peloponnese, they grew thirsty. They encountered Hypsipyle, former queen of Lemnos, now a nursemaid to Opheltes, the infant son of King Lycurgus of Nemea. When the heroes asked her for water, Hypsipyle, eager to help, laid the baby Opheltes down in a patch of wild parsley, or celery, while she led them to a nearby spring. In her brief absence, a serpent, a guardian of the spring or simply a creature of the wild, found the infant and bit him, killing him. The heroes, returning refreshed, found Hypsipyle distraught and the child dead. Amphiaraus interpreted this event as a dire omen, portending disaster for their expedition. He renamed the child Archemorus, meaning, quote, beginner of doom, or forerunner of death, signifying that his death was but the first of many to come. To propitiate the gods and honor the dead child, the 7 champions founded funeral games at Nemea, the Nemean Games, which would become one of the great Panhellenic festivals, celebrated with athletic contests and chariot races. The judges at these games would traditionally wear dark robes in mourning for Archemorus, and the victor's crown was made of wild parsley or celery, the very plant on which the ill-fated infant had been laid. Though they performed the necessary rites, the shadow of Archemorus' death and Amphiaraus' interpretation hung over the army as they resumed their march. Finally, the Argive forces arrived before the towering walls of Thebes. This city, under the resolute command of Eteocles, was prepared for a siege. Eteocles, counseled by the seer Tiresias, who, despite his blindness, still served Thebes with his prophetic wisdom, had assigned his own loyal champions to defend each of the city's 7 gates, matching the attacker's gate for gate. The air grew thick with anticipation and the grim certainty of impending slaughter. The stage was meticulously set for a brutal confrontation, a war not just between 2 cities, but between 2 brothers, fueled by ambition, betrayal, and an ancient, inexorable curse that demanded its due in blood. The fate of Thebes and of the 7 champions who sought to conquer it hung precariously in the balance as the first skirmishes began and the full fury of the siege was about to be unleashed. The gods on Olympus watched, some with sympathy, others with cold indifference, as mortals prepared to play out another bloody act in the long drama of their intertwined destinies. The heroes arrayed themselves, each champion choosing or being assigned a specific gate to attack, and against each, a Theban defender stood ready. The clash was inevitable, and the prophecies of doom whispered on the wind. Tiresias, the blind seer, had also conveyed a chilling prophecy to the Thebans. The city could only be saved if a descendant of the Spartoi, one of the sown men who sprang from the dragon's teeth Cadmus had planted, voluntarily sacrificed himself for Thebes. Creon, Jocasta's brother and a prominent Theban leader, had a young son named Menetius, sometimes called Megareus. Hearing the prophecy and understanding its implications for his family line, Creon was understandably distressed. However, his son Menetius, driven by patriotic fervor and a noble sense of duty, or perhaps compelled by Ares, whose sacred dragon had been slain by Cadmus, chose to embrace this fate. Unbeknownst to many, or in some versions openly declaring his intent, Menetius ascended the city walls and took his own life, offering himself as the necessary sacrifice to ensure Thebes' survival. This act of selfless devotion, it was believed, appeased the ancient wrath, and tilted the scales of divine favor, however slightly, towards the defenders. The siege began in earnest. Each of the 7 Argive champions led their contingent against one of Thebes' 7 gates. At the Proetid Gate, Tydeus, raging like a wounded lion, fought with unparalleled ferocity against the Theban defender Melanippus. Though Tydeus was mortally wounded by Melanippus, he managed to slay his opponent in turn. In his dying moments, a horrifying act occurred. Athena, who had favored Tydeus for his bravery, was descending from Olympus with a divine elixir that would have granted him immortality. However, Amphiaraus, who despised Tydeus for his bloodthirsty nature, and perhaps to ensure the failure of the expedition as prophesied, or out of sheer revulsion, cut off Melanippus' head and brought it to Tydeus. In a final, savage display, Tydeus split open the skull and devoured the brains of his fallen enemy. Athena, witnessing this barbaric act, was so disgusted that she recoiled, spilled the elixir, and abandoned Tydeus to his death, denying him immortality. At another gate, the proud Capaneus, true to his boastful nature, brought a siege ladder against the walls and began to ascend, proclaiming that not even Zeus himself could stop him. As he reached the parapet, Zeus, angered by his hubris and impiety, struck him down with a blazing thunderbolt. Capaneus, wreathed in divine fire, crashed to the ground, a smoking ruin, a stark warning against challenging the might of the Olympians. His death sent a shockwave of fear through the Argive ranks. Parthenopaeus, the young Arcadian, fought bravely at the Nystan Gate or Electran Gate, but his youthful ardor was no match for the seasoned Theban defenders. He was slain by Periclymenus, a descendant of the Spartoi and a mighty warrior, or by Amphictyon Dryas, his shield unable to protect him from a fatal blow, perhaps a spear or a large stone cast from the walls. Hippomedon, after performing great feats of valor and slaying many Thebans at the Ogygian Gate, was eventually overwhelmed and killed, drowned in the river Ismenias by some accounts, or cut down in fierce fighting. Polynices himself led the assault on the Hypsistan Gate, highest gate, or another gate directly facing his brother Eteocles. The tension here was personal and palpable. Eteocles, equally determined to defend his city and his crown, met him in combat. The brothers, consumed by a generation of hatred and the weight of their father's curse, finally faced each other. Their duel was bitter and brutal. They fought with a desperate fury, each knowing that only one could survive. In the end, they inflicted mortal wounds upon each other, fulfilling Oedipus's terrible prophecy that they would die by each other's hand. As they lay dying, side by side, their enmity persisted even to their last breaths. Meanwhile, Amphiaraus, the seer, fought with courage despite knowing his fate. He commanded his chariot at the Homoloian gate, inflicting heavy losses on the Thebans. But as the Argive forces began to falter and retreat, with most of their champions fallen, Amphiaraus turned his chariot to flee. He was pursued by the Theban Periclymenus. To save his favored seer from the ignominy of being struck in the back, Zeus intervened dramatically. The king of the gods split the earth with a thunderbolt, and Amphiaraus, along with his chariot, horses, and charioteer baton, was swallowed whole by the chasm, disappearing into the underworld alive. He would continue to be honored as a chthonic deity and an oracular hero at sites where the earth was said to have opened. With all their champions dead except for Adrastus, who escaped on his swift, divine horse Arion, the Argive army was utterly routed. The first expedition of the Seven against Thebes ended in catastrophic failure. Just as Amphiaraus had foretold, Thebes had successfully defended itself, but at a terrible cost, including the lives of its king, Eteocles, and many of its finest warriors, not to mention the self-sacrifice of Odysseus. The battlefield outside its gates was littered with the dead, a grim testament to the destructive power of familial strife and broken oaths. Would you like another passage narrated? Creon, as the brother of Jocasta and uncle to Eteocles and Polynices, once again assumed the regency of the devastated city. His first decree was a fateful one, setting the stage for yet another tragedy that would spring from this bloody conflict. He ordered that the Argive dead, including Polynices, were to be left unburied, to be devoured by dogs and birds, as traitors who had attacked their own city. Eteocles, as the defender of Thebes, was to be buried with full honors. This edict, particularly concerning Polynices, directly defied the sacred, unwritten laws of the gods, which demanded that all dead receive proper burial rites to allow their souls to find peace in the underworld. It was an act of political expediency and vengeance that would directly challenge the conscience and courage of Antigone, the last surviving daughter of Oedipus. Antigone heard Creon's proclamation with a cold dread that quickly hardened into resolute defiance. To leave her brother Polynices, regardless of his actions against Thebes, unburied, unmourned, a prey for carrion birds and scavenging dogs, was an affront to the gods, an outrage against family piety, and an unbearable personal dishonor. The laws of the gods concerning the dead were ancient and immutable, transcending any decree made by a mortal king, even one who was her uncle and now the ruler of her city. She knew the penalty for disobeying Creon's edict was death, but in her eyes, to obey such a law would be a far greater transgression, a betrayal of her deepest moral convictions and her familial duty. Her sister Ismene shared her grief, but not her resolve. When Antigone approached Ismene, seeking an ally in her desperate plan to perform funeral rites for Polynices, Ismene recoiled in fear. She pleaded with Antigone to be sensible, to remember their family's tragic history, their father Oedipus, who died in shame, their mother Jocasta, who took her own life, their brothers Eteocles and Polynices, who had just slaughtered each other. They were the last, two women, weak and powerless against the might of the state and Creon's unyielding will. To defy him meant certain death. Ismene argued for obedience, for survival, believing that women were not meant to fight against men or challenge the law of the city. Antigone listened to her sister's pleas with a mixture of pity and scorn. She declared that she would bury her brother, even if she had to do it alone. If she died in the attempt, it would be a noble death, a death for piety. She would be dear to her brother in the underworld, having done what was right. She felt a stronger loyalty to the dead and the laws of the gods than to the living and the laws of men. I will not be a traitor to them, she asserted, turning away from Ismene, who wept for her sister's impending doom but dared not join her. Under the cover of darkness, or in some accounts in broad daylight, defying Creon's guards, Antigone went to the battlefield where Polynices' body lay exposed. She performed the essential rituals. She sprinkled dust over his corpse, a symbolic act of burial, and poured libations, honoring his spirit. Some say she found that a mysterious dust storm had already covered the body once, a sign of divine favor, and she returned to complete the rites. Guards, set by Creon to watch the body, discovered her actions. They cleared the dust from Polynices and lay in wait. Antigone, undeterred, returned to the site to re-perform the rites when she saw her brother's body once again desecrated. This time, the guards seized her and brought her before King Creon. The confrontation between Antigone and Creon was a clash of two irreconcilable principles. Creon, incensed that his authority had been so flagrantly challenged, and by a woman, his own niece, demanded to know if she confessed to the deed. Antigone did not deny it. She stood before him, proud and unyielding, admitting her actions and defending them not as an act of rebellion against the state, but as an act of obedience to a higher divine law. She argued that Creon's edict, being mortal, could not override the unwritten and unfailing statutes of the gods, which decreed that all dead must receive due burial. These divine laws, she proclaimed, were not of today or yesterday, but lived eternally, and no one knew their origin. To transgress them out of fear of a human tyrant would be to incur the wrath of the gods, a far more terrifying prospect than any punishment Creon could inflict. She declared she was born to share love, not hatred, and her duty to her brother transcended political enmities. Creon, however, saw her defiance as sheer anarchy and a direct threat to his rule and the stability of Thebes, which he believed depended on absolute obedience to the law. He accused her of arrogance and of glorying in her crime. He was unmoved by her arguments about divine law, viewing them as mere excuses for insubordination. He believed that an enemy of the state, even in death, deserved no honor. To yield to her would be to show weakness, to be ruled by a woman, something intolerable to his rigid sense of order and authority. When Ismene, overcome by remorse and a surge of familial loyalty, tried to claim a share in Antigone's guilt, Antigone rejected her, stating that Ismene had chosen life and obedience, while she had chosen death and piety. Creon, suspecting Ismene might also be complicit, or simply to make an example, condemned both sisters to death, though he later commuted Ismene's sentence, focusing his wrath solely on Antigone. How was that narration? The sentence for Antigone was to be walled up alive in a rock-hewn tomb, a cave outside the city, with a small amount of food and water. Not a direct execution by stoning, as initially threatened, but a slow death by starvation or suffocation, a way for the city to avoid direct blood guilt for her death. As Antigone was led away to her living grave, she lamented her fate, to die unmarried, without a wedding song, to become a bride of Acheron, the river of woe in the underworld. Yet she remained steadfast in her conviction that she had acted justly. At this point, Haemon, Creon's son and Antigone's betrothed, entered the scene. He loved Antigone deeply, and was horrified by his father's decree. He approached Creon, initially with respect, attempting to reason with him. Haemon reported that the people of Thebes, though they dared not speak openly for fear of Creon, sympathized with Antigone, believing her actions to be noble and undeserving of such a cruel punishment. He urged his father to be flexible, to listen to reason, to understand that wisdom did not reside in one man alone. He used metaphors, comparing a rigid ruler to a tree that does not bend in a storm and is uprooted, or a ship whose sails are kept too taut and capsizes. He pleaded for Antigone's life, not just out of love, but for the sake of justice and his father's own reputation. Creon, however, reacted with fury to his son's intervention. He accused Haemon of being woman-struck, of siding with a traitor against his own father and the state. He berated Haemon for his youth and impudence, asserting his absolute authority as king and father. The argument escalated, with Haemon growing more desperate and defiant, accusing his father of trampling on justice and ruling a desert rather than a city if he refused to listen to others. Haemon warned that Antigone's death would cause another. Creon, misinterpreting this as a threat against his own life, became even more enraged and ordered Antigone to be brought forth to die in Haemon's presence. Haemon, in despair and disgust, declared he would never see his father's face again and rushed away. It was only then, after Haemon's departure, that the blind prophet Tiresias arrived, led by a boy. Tiresias, who had served Thebes for many years, brought dire warnings from the gods. He told Creon that the gods were displeased. The altars of Thebes were polluted because birds and dogs had carried flesh from Polynices' unburied corpse to them. Sacrificial fires would not light, and birds of omen uttered strange, unholy cries. Tiresias warned Creon that his stubborn pride and his refusal to bury Polynices, along with his cruel punishment of Antigone for her pious act, had brought a blight upon the city. The seer advised Creon to yield, to bury the dead, and release Antigone. "All men make mistakes," Tiresias said, "but a good man yields when he knows his course is wrong, and repairs the evil. The only crime is pride." Creon, initially respectful of Tiresias, soon grew angry and suspicious. just as he had with Oedipus years before. He accused the prophet of being bribed, of fabricating prophecies for profit. Tiresias, deeply offended, then delivered his final terrible prophecy. Because Creon had wrongly entombed the living Antigone and wrongly kept the dead from the underworld, Polynices, he would pay with the death of his own flesh and blood. The Furies were stirring, and his house would soon be filled with wailing. Curses would arise against him from all cities whose unburied sons lay rotting on the Theban plain. With these chilling words, Tiresias departed, leaving Creon shaken to his core. The chorus of Theban elders, who had previously supported Creon, or remained cautiously neutral, now urged him to heed Tiresias' warnings. The prophet had never been wrong. Fear finally pierced Creon's armor of pride. He admitted his error and, in a panic, resolved to undo his actions. He himself would lead the way to free Antigone and to bury Polynices. He rushed off with his attendants, first to give Polynices a proper burial. They performed the rites, cremated his remains, and raised a mound over his ashes. Then, with grim foreboding, Creon hurried to the stone tomb where Antigone had been imprisoned. As they approached, they heard a voice from within, a sound of wailing. It was Haemon's voice. They tore away the stones, sealing the entrance, and rushed inside. A horrific sight met their eyes. Antigone, despairing of rescue and unwilling to endure a slow death, had hanged herself, using a strip of linen from her own gown, or her veil. Haemon was clinging to her lifeless body, weeping in agony. When Haemon saw his father, his grief turned to savage rage. He spat in Creon's face and drew his sword, lunging at his father. Creon managed to dodge the blow. Then, in utter despair and self-loathing for what his father had driven him to, Haemon turned the sword upon himself, leaning on it and driving it into his own side. He died, embracing Antigone, their tragic marriage fulfilled only in death. Creon, utterly broken, emerged from the tomb bearing Haemon's body. His pride had led to unimaginable ruin, but the tragedy was not yet complete. As he returned to the palace, a messenger met him with news of yet another death. Queen Eurydice, Creon's wife and Haemon's mother, upon hearing from the messenger the full extent of the catastrophe, the deaths of Antigone and her beloved son Haemon, had retired to her chambers. There, at the palace altar, she cursed her husband as the killer of her child and then took her own life with a dagger. Creon was left a shattered man, stripped of his family, his authority undermined, his city still bearing the scars of divine displeasure. He lamented his folly, his stubbornness, his rash, deadly thoughts. He had sought to uphold order but had created only chaos and sorrow. He acknowledged his own guilt, crying out that he himself was the slayer of his son and wife. He prayed for his own death, but that was a release denied him. He was condemned to live with the crushing weight of his actions, a living example of the tragic consequences of hubris and the inescapable power of divine law. Thebes had survived the War of the Seven, but its royal house was once again steeped in blood and grief, a grim pattern that seemed destined to repeat. The disastrous outcome of the first expedition of the Seven against Thebes, and particularly the treacherous death of Amphiaraus, directly set the stage for the next chapter in this bloody saga. Amphiaraus, before being swallowed by the earth, had charged his sons, Alcmaeon and Amphilochus, with two solemn duties: to avenge his death by killing their mother, Eriphyle, whose greed for the necklace of Harmonia had sent him to his doom, and then to lead a second expedition against Thebes. He prophesied that this second attempt, led by the sons of the fallen champions, known as the Epigoni, meaning the offspring, or those born after, would be successful. 10 years passed. The sons of the Seven grew to manhood, nursing the memory of their father's defeat and deaths. They inherited not only their father's valor, but also the duty of vengeance in the quest for glory. Adrastus, the sole surviving champion of the first expedition, was instrumental in organizing this new generation of warriors. The Oracle of Delphi was consulted once more, and it too predicted victory for the Epigoni, but only if Alcmaeon, son of Amphiaraus, was their leader. Alcmaeon, like his father, was initially reluctant, not least because he had not yet fulfilled the first part of his father's command, the matricide of Eriphyle. The cursed necklace of Harmonia, it seemed, still had a role to play. Thersander, son of Polynices, seeking to ensure Alcmaeon's leadership and thus the expedition's success, employed the same corrupting tactic his father had used. He bribed Eriphyle once again, this time with the sacred robe of Harmonia, another beautiful but ill-omened artifact, to persuade Alcmaeon to lead the Epigoni. Eriphyle, Her greed, apparently insatiable, succumbed once more. Alcmaeon, discovering her renewed treachery, and perhaps now feeling fully justified, or compelled by Apollo, finally killed his mother, thus fulfilling the first part of his father's grim injunction. However, this act of matricide, even if divinely sanctioned or fated, would bring its own terrible consequences upon Alcmaeon, hounding him by the Erinyes. But with Eriphyle dead and Alcmaeon now committed, the army of the Epigoni was ready to march on Thebes. Their ranks included Thersander, son of Polynices, Achilles, son of Adrastus, Diomedes, son of Tydeus, Sthenelus, son of Capaneus, Promachus, son of Parthenopaeus, Euryalus, son of Messicius, one of the Argives who fought with Tydeus, and Amphilochus, Alcmaeon's brother. This new generation was determined to succeed where their fathers had failed, to finally conquer the city of Cadmus and avenge the fallen seven. Thebes, still recovering from its previous trials, now faced a fresh onslaught, its fate once again hanging in the balance. The armies of the Epigoni, burning with a righteous fury inherited from their fathers and bolstered by divine prophecy, advanced upon the city of Thebes. Laodamas, son of Eteocles, now sat on the Theban throne, and he prepared to defend his city with the same grim determination his father had shown. The Thebans, though weary from past conflicts, rallied to protect their homes. The memory of Menaceus' sacrifice still lingered, a testament to Theban resilience. But the pronouncements of Apollo weighed heavily in favor of the attackers. The initial clashes were fierce. The Epigoni, younger and perhaps more skilled, or simply favored by fate, began to gain the upper hand. A major battle was fought at Glissus, a short distance from Thebes. Here, the tide turned decisively in favor of the Argive forces. However, the victory was not without cost to the Epigoni. Aegialeus, son of Adrastus and the only one of the original seven to survive the first campaign, was slain in the thick of the fighting by King Laodamas himself. Adrastus, though not present as a combatant in this second war, would thus suffer the grief of outliving his son, a bitter irony for the man who had led the first doomed charge. Yet, Aegialeus' death was swiftly avenged. Alcmaeon, leading the Epigoni with divine mandate, met Laodamas in combat and struck down the Theban king. With their king slain and their forces depleted, the remaining Thebans lost heart. It was at this critical juncture that the aged seer Tiresias once again offered counsel. Realizing that further resistance was futile and would only lead to the utter destruction of the city and its people, Tiresias advised the Thebans to send a herald to the Argive camp to negotiate a truce, and then, under the cover of darkness, to abandon Thebes and flee for their lives. The Thebans, heeding his words, sent their herald, and, while the Epigoni considered the terms, the populace, led by Tiresias, slipped away from the city, seeking refuge in Illyria or other distant lands. Tiresias himself, having guided his people to safety one last time, was said to have died shortly thereafter at a spring called Tilphusa, having drunk its waters, his long and prophetic life finally coming to an end. He had witnessed the rise and fall of generations, the playing out of terrible curses, and the inexorable will of the gods. The following morning, the Epigoni, discovering the city largely deserted, marched into Thebes unopposed. How do you think that narration flowed? They had achieved what their fathers could not. They plundered the city, taking much treasure, and then, in an act of symbolic justice and fulfillment of their quest, they razed its mighty walls to the ground, or at least significantly damaged its fortifications, ensuring it would not soon rise again as a major power to threaten Argos. Thersander, son of Polynices and Argaea, was installed as the new king of Thebes, reclaiming his father's lost birthright, though over a city much diminished. A portion of the spoils, including the fateful necklace of Harmonia and her sacred robe, which had once again been used to sway a decision towards war and death, were dedicated by the victorious Epigoni at the sanctuary of Apollo in Delphi. It was perhaps hoped that by placing these cursed objects in the care of the god, their malevolent influence might finally be neutralized, or at least contained. For Alcmaeon, however, the victory over Thebes brought no lasting peace. The blood of his mother, Eriphyle, cried out for vengeance. The Erinyes, the dreaded Furies, goddesses of retribution, began to pursue him relentlessly, driving him into madness, hounding him from place to place. His participation in the war, even as its prophesied leader, could not wash away the stain of matricide. He wandered, tormented and defiled, seeking purification. His journey led him to Sophis in Arcadia, to the court of King Phegeus. Phegeus, a just ruler, took pity on the distraught hero and performed the rites of purification, cleansing him of the blood guilt, or so it seemed. Alcmaeon, finding temporary respite, married Phegeus' daughter Arsinoe, also known as Alphysibia, as a bridal gift, or perhaps to secure her affections and demonstrate his wealth. He gave her the cursed necklace and robe of Harmonia, which she had presumably reclaimed from the spoils before their dedication at Delphi, or which their sander had given him. For a time, there was peace, but the curse was not so easily appeased, nor the Erinyes so easily dissuaded. Soon the land of Sophis began to suffer from barrenness and famine, a sign that the pollution of Alcmaeon's presence was too potent for Phegeus' purification to contain. Driven mad once more by the Furies, or advised that the land suffered on his account, Alcmaeon was forced to leave Sophis and his wife Arsinoe. He consulted the oracle of Apollo at Delphi again, desperately seeking a permanent release from his tormentors. The oracle declared that he would find peace only in a land that had not been in existence, and upon which the sun had not shone at the time he committed the matricide. This cryptic pronouncement led him to the mouth of the Achilles River, the largest river in Greece. There, the river god Achilles, a powerful deity often depicted as a bull-headed man, or a man with a bull's horn, had recently formed new land from alluvial deposits. Fresh earth washed down from the mountains, creating islands and extending the delta. This newly formed land met the oracle's conditions. Here, at the Achilles Delta, Alcmaeon was finally and truly purified of his mother's murder by the river god himself. He settled on this new land and married Caliro, the beautiful daughter of Achilles. They had two sons, Acarnan and Amphitryon, and for a while, Alcmaeon enjoyed a period of tranquility, free from the Erinyes' pursuit. However, the cursed treasures were not yet done with their deadly work. His new wife, Caliro, learned of the magnificent necklace and robe of Harmonia that Alcmaeon had previously given to Arsinoe. Filled with desire for these legendary adornments, perhaps unaware of their full history, or simply covetous of their beauty and fame, Caliro refused to continue living with Alcmaeon unless he procured them for her. She declared she would not share his bed until she possessed the most famous jewels in the world. Alcmaeon, deeply in love with Caliro, or perhaps fearing to lose this newfound peace, found himself in a terrible dilemma. He was reluctant to part with Caliro, yet retrieving the treasures from Arsinoe and Phegeus was fraught with danger and deceit. He devised a plan. He returned to Sophis and to his former father-in-law, King Phegeus. He falsely claimed that he was still pursued by the Erinyes, and that the oracle had declared he would only be freed from their torment if he dedicated the necklace and robe of Harmonia at Delphi. He asked Phegeus to persuade Arsinoe to return the treasures for this sacred purpose. Phegeus, believing Alcmaeon's plight and his pious intention, and perhaps also wishing to rid his land permanently of any lingering curse, compelled his daughter Arsinoe to give up the necklace and robe. Arsinoe, though perhaps reluctant, obeyed her father. Alcmaeon secured the fatal treasures, but his deception did not remain secret for long. A servant revealed Alcmaeon's true intentions to Phegeus, that he wanted the jewels not for Delphi, but for his new wife Caliro. Or, in another version, Alcmaeon was overheard boasting of his cleverness. Enraged by this treachery and the insult to his daughter, Phegeus ordered his sons, Turnus and Agenor, or Temenus and Axion in other accounts, to avenge the dishonor. They lay in ambush for Alcmaeon as he was leaving Sophis and murdered him. Thus, the hero who had led the victorious Epigone against Thebes, who had been purified by a river god and momentarily escaped the Furies, met his end through his own deceit, a victim of the enduring curse attached to the very objects he sought. The fate of Arsinoe following Alcmaeon's death varies in different accounts. Some say that, unaware of Alcmaeon's deceit and believing her brothers had unjustly killed her husband, she cursed them and her father, praying that their land would remain barren and that they would die an evil death before the next harvest unless someone else possessed the necklace and robe. Would you like another narration? In other versions, when she learned of Alcmaeon's treachery and protested her brother's murderous actions too vehemently, her father, enraged, had her locked in a chest and sold into slavery to Agapinor, king of Tegea, falsely accusing her of Alcmaeon's murder. Meanwhile, Caliro, back at the Achilles Delta, learned of her husband Alcmaeon's murder. Filled with grief and a desire for vengeance, she prayed to Zeus, her divine ancestor, Achilles being a son of Oceanus and Tethys, or of Helios and Gaia, asking that her infant sons Acarnan and Amphitryon be made to grow to manhood instantly so they could avenge their father's death. Zeus, perhaps moved by her plight or by the intricate workings of fate, granted her extraordinary request. The boys matured overnight into strong young men. Armed and ready, they set out for Sisyphus. They intercepted the sons of Theseus, who were on their way to Delphi to dedicate the necklace and robe, perhaps in an attempt to expiate their own crime or fulfill Alcmaeon's supposed original intent. Alcmaeon's sons killed their father's murderers. They then continued to Sisyphus, where they slew King Theseus himself and, in some versions, his wife. Having avenged their father Acarnan and Amphoterus, on the advice of their grandfather Achilles, took the blood-soaked necklace and robe of Harmonia and finally dedicated them at the sanctuary of Apollo in Delphi, as Alcmaeon had falsely claimed he intended to do. There, the cursed treasures remained for many generations, objects of wonder and dread. Their malevolent power perhaps finally neutralized by being placed under the protection of the god of light and prophecy. Their story served as a chilling reminder of how beauty and divine craftsmanship could be intertwined with inescapable doom, bringing ruin to successive owners. The land of Acarnania in western Greece was said to have been named after Acarnan, one of Alcmaeon's avenging sons, who settled there. The saga of the House of Thebes, from Cadmus and the dragon's teeth to the tragic fates of Laius, Oedipus, his children, and finally the Epigone and Alcmaeon, thus drew to a close. A long and bloody tapestry woven with threads of divine wrath, human folly, incestuous unions, matricide, fratricide, and the inescapable power of curses. Thebes itself, though rebuilt by Thersander, would never regain its former prominence in the heroic age, its legacy forever overshadowed by the profound tragedies it had nurtured. Its stories, however, particularly that of Oedipus and Antigone, would resonate through the ages, explored and reinterpreted by poets and playwrights, becoming cornerstones of Western literature and thought, potent meditations on fate, free will, guilt, and the often unfathomable relationship between mortals and the gods. The echoes of its suffering served as a dark counterpoint to the glories of other heroic centers, a reminder that even the most valiant efforts could be undone by the weight of an ancestral curse, or a moment of tragic misjudgment. The cycle of violence that had plagued the descendants of Cadmus had, for the most part, run its course, leaving behind a landscape littered with cautionary tales and profound sorrow. The focus of mythic narrative would increasingly shift towards other heroes and other looming conflicts, most notably the gathering storm that would eventually break as the Trojan War, a conflict in which some of the Epigoni, like Diomedes, son of Tydeus, would go on to play even greater roles, their Theban experiences perhaps shaping their later exploits on the plains of Troy. Thebes had taught the Greek world much about suffering, and its lessons were not easily forgotten. Are there any other scripts you would like me to read?